Chapter 1. Well, Charleston International Airport was just adorable, wasn't it? Ditie Weston had to smile as she strolled past the ticket counters. She'd arrived early, and while she knew she probably could have just waited in the cell phone lot for the call to come pick up her new employee, she hated the thought of missing out on this place. She loved airports. And train stations. And even bus terminals, actually. She loved watching people on their travels, knowing they were headed for someplace new and exciting, or coming home after some adventure. And as far as she was concerned, any kind of travel was an adventure, even if it was just to Scranton for work, or a business trip to Florida. Or a cross-country drive to Charleston, to move in with Aunt Gertie. Sighing, Ditie shoved her hands in the pockets of her shorts and tried to shrug the tension out of her shoulders. She's in a better place now. That's what the preacher had assured her when she'd arranged Aunt Gertie's funeral service. Ditie knew her great-aunt was beyond all pain now, and that was a blessing, but the last year, watching the old woman slip further and further away, had been the hardest experience of her life. But she'd loved the old bat, and for some reason, of all her family, Aunt Gertie had adored Ditie most of all. So when Aunt Gertie had needed her, Ditie had put her life on hold and moved to Charleston. Although not by plane, which was a bit of a shame, because it would have been fun to fly into this place. Smiling, Ditie took note of the newsstands and restaurants. This airport wasn't the smallest she'd been in, but it definitely was no hub. Whoever had named it International must have been a bit ambitious. Unless a plane from the Bahamas had once made an emergency landing here or something. There was a customs area, but she had to wonder how often it got used. Flight 111 from Denver is arriving at Gate B4. The announcement was one of many, but Ditie had been listening especially for that flight number and was pleased to hear it was on time. Sure, she could have just pulled up her flight app, but where was the fun in that? She needed to be here, listening to the announcements, smelling the sense of anticipation and lost luggage, basking in the hustle and bustle. This is what it was all about. Suddenly, Ditie was filled with a wonderful sense of certainty. I'm going on an adventure. Sure, it wouldn't be today, and it wasn't now. But it had been so long since she'd been able to travel, and now, she was about to embark again. On a grand adventure, one she'd never before experienced. She just needed the plane to land so she could get started. Her phone buzzed, and she stepped out of the flow of people to scramble for her crossbody purse. It was really more of a messenger bag, but she was a gal who liked to carry stuff with her. She pushed aside a sweater, a water bottle, 3 granola bars, a pack of gum, I was looking for that, 2 packets of tissues, a spoon, eye drops, shoestring. She didn't wear tennis shoes, but you never knew when you might need a shoestring, 3 bottles of hand sanitizer and a novelty ice cream scoop, before finally pulling out her phone. One of these days, I need to clean this thing out. Fumbling, she flipped the phone over and smiled when she saw her big sister's name. Hi, Artie, she said, thrilled to hear from home. How's life? Are you calling to tell me I'm going to be an aunt? Geez Louise, you all need to calm down. I swear, Mom asked me the exact same thing when I called her last week. Grinning, Ditie swung her bag back around to her but, then cupped her hand around the phone to block out some of the noise around her. Well, if you'd call more than once a month, we might not jump to conclusions. Her sister had gotten married earlier that summer, actually, 4 of Ditie's sisters had gotten married that summer, which was a little ridiculous, and as the oldest besides Jack's, apparently everyone was expecting Artie and her new husband, Wyatt, to start popping out babies soon. Well, Wyatt probably won't be popping any babies out. But if he did, that would be interesting. Of course, she'd met Wyatt a few times over the years, since he and Jax were best friends, and she couldn't recall there being anything weird about him. Surely someone would have mentioned something important like that to her, right? Important like, Ditie, your new brother-in-law can give birth? That seemed important, so since no one had mentioned it, she should probably assume it wasn't. Ditie? You still there? Ditie jerked, realizing she'd been lost in her musings, and hummed into the phone. I'm here, sorry. At the airport, so things are a little crazy. Oh, awesome. I was actually just calling, more than once a month, to see if you'd picked Rhodey up yet. Ditie glanced up at the arrivals board and saw his plane had already landed. Not yet, but I'm heading to baggage to meet him. She matched action to claim by heading in the direction of the arrows. That's great. Are you cool with him? Anything else you need from my end? Shaking her head, even though she knew her sister couldn't see her, Ditie dodged around a family pushing an overloaded luggage cart, with a toddler perched precariously on top. I haven't met the guy yet, but I really appreciate you hooking us up. No problem. When I mentioned your problem to Lainey, she was the one who'd suggested Rhodey as the solution. I can't believe she was able to even think about my issues when she's got that new cutie pie in her life. On the other end of the phone, Artie chuckled. Baby Blossom has got to be the cutest little baby in creation. Although I think I'm obligated to say that Wyatt's niece CJ is the cutest first grader. And since I suspect she's going to be a big sister in the spring, Blossom's going to have some competition here on the ranch when it comes to babies. Out of breath, Ditie made it to the baggage claim area and started checking the monitors to figure out which of the carousels her new employee's luggage would be arriving on. Not that it mattered, from where she stood she could see all of them. Distractedly, she said to her sister, "You haven't sent me any photos in a week. Lainey at least sent me some of Blossom." Ditie would never begrudge the time she'd spent here in Charleston with Aunt Gertie, especially near the end. But she had missed her siblings, in particular her sisters and her twin brother, Don. She'd missed out on all the excitement in her family over the summer and relied on her sisters to send her photos. She loved it when she got to see the new couples, their arms around one another and looking so darn in love. Okay, Artie huffed. Hold on, I'll send you one of wager. There was the sound of fumbling, and Ditie pulled the phone away from her ear to see an incoming text message. She clicked on it and squealed. Oh, Artie. He's adorable. Which one? The dog, or Wyatt? The photo was of a handsome man with light green eyes, smiling widely, as a puppy tried to climb up his shoulder. This brother-in-law of hers was handsome all right, but Ditie was a sucker for puppy pictures. The dog, of course. That scruffy-looking wannabe cowboy who's holding him could use a... Hey now, my husband is not a wannabe cowboy. Oh please, Ditie snorted teasingly, moving toward the waiting zone. He's not even wearing a hat. And you know all about cowboys, do you? Hey, what can I say? I like cowboys. Artie blew a raspberry. You wouldn't know a cowboy if he sat on you. I think I would notice that. And noticing if one is sitting on you makes you an expert? But Ditie couldn't answer, because at that moment she did know all about cowboys. And very much knew what she liked. One was walking toward her right now. A man in a cowboy hat had just stepped into the baggage area, and Ditie felt her jaw drop. Lord in heaven, the man was divine. He was tall and lanky, a blue button-up shirt tucked into jeans, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms covered in a sprinkling of dark hairs. He had a jaw which made Ditie's mouth water, and wide lips, which were pulled into a sensual smirk. And his hands. Heaven help her, his hands. She'd always been a sucker for a set of calloused, rough hands, and when this man lifted one to scratch at his clean-shaven jaw, her knees went weak. Hey, sis, you still there? Ditie couldn't drag her eyes away from the newly arrived cowboy. She tried to remind herself it was a flight from Denver, so there was bound to be at least one cowboy on board. But there was something about him. Artie, she managed to choke, what does Rhodey look like? Oh, I guess I should have sent you a photo or something so you'd recognize him, huh? The man's warm gaze slid past Ditie to the baggage carousel, and she found herself able to breathe again. Is he, really handsome? On the other end of the phone, her sister hummed. Not compared to Wyatt, but he's no slouch. Tall, kinda on the lean side, dark hair. And hands that make you want to moan? Ditie whispered, her eyes still glued to him. What? His hands? Blinking, Ditie forced her gaze away and commanded herself to focus on the conversation. Yeah. His hands. He has nice hands. He's a mechanic, right? Her sister sounded skeptical when she replied, sort of. He can drive anything with wheels, Wyatt claims, and he's in charge of the ranch's vehicles. That's why Lainey thought of him for your problem. Oh, if only all my problems could be solved in so handsome a manner. Ditie, you're going to be stuck with this guy in close quarters. Are you going to be okay? Sure. Ditie blurted, a little too high-pitched. Then she cleared her throat and tried again. Sure. Look, Rhodey's flight just landed, and he didn't text me, but I'm looking at a man in a cowboy hat right now, and I'm kinda praying it is him, but also terrified, because OMG he's gorgeous. With nice hands? Artie asked blandly. Distractedly, Ditie muttered, hey, we don't kink-shame in this family. Her sister snorted. Okay, I'll let you go find out if it's him, and I'm going to sit here and try to remember if I've ever noticed Rhodey's hands. Or any man's hands, for that matter. But before I do. It was the seriousness of her sister's tone which made Ditie pay attention. What's up? I just wanted to tell you that you did a good job, little sis. I'm sorry none of us were there at the end, but you've been incredibly strong for Aunt Gertie. You've tackled things none of us should have to deal with in our 20s, and you've handled it really well. So, good job. Artie's words drove all thoughts of the handsome cowboy from Ditie's mind. Her throat closed up with emotion, and she realized she was nodding, as if her sister could see her. She cleared her throat and managed to say, thank you. I don't want to do it again, but I'm glad I was here for her over the last year. I know she was glad for you too, and we were all glad to know you were with her. And now you get your reward for all your hard work. It was weird to think of this adventure as a reward, but it kind of was. Aunt Gertie had always known Ditie was the wanderer in their branch of the family, and she'd arranged for Ditie to have that opportunity now. Thanks, she said again, although her heart was lightening. Okay then, go figure out if that's him, or if it's not, where he's hiding. Rhodey's a good guy and a brilliant driver, and he'll make sure you get your new toy back home. And if you end up hating his guts, remember, it's only for a week, and it was Lainey's idea. Bye. Artie hung up before Ditie could scoff at her reminder. When her sisters had first suggested this unusual solution, she'd been hesitant. But everything she'd heard about Rhodey Fellows told her she'd be fine with the man for a week. Especially if he was as fine as that cowboy over there by Carousel too. I'll be fine with that fine man? She snorted at her own stupid joke and scrolled through her texts until she found his number. Holding her breath, she typed, have you landed yet? And pressed send. And when the man in the cowboy hat reached for his back pocket and pulled out a phone with one of those gorgeously calloused hands, Ditie's heart started beating double time. Have you landed yet? Rhodey winced as he read the message. He was supposed to have texted her when he landed so she could come pick him up. Artie and Lainey's sister was probably waiting for him in the lot and wanted to know if he was on his way, so he quickly typed back, yeah, waiting at luggage right now. Be out soon. He started to put his phone back in his pocket, but to his surprise, it buzzed right away. A new message popped up. I'm inside by baggage too. Surprised, Rhodey's gaze snapped up from his phone, and he scanned the crowd around him. The Charleston airport sure was bigger than Helena's, but even so, he could see most folks. Unbidden, his eyes fell on the cute blonde he'd noticed when he'd entered the baggage claim area. She was just slightly on the plump side, with curves he wouldn't mind spending a while admiring, were he not a gentleman, that is, poured into a pair of white shorts and a red t-shirt. She was holding a phone. And looking straight at him. Swallowing, he glanced down at his phone just long enough to type, I'm the one in the cowboy hat. The blonde's gaze darted to her phone, and when she looked up, she was smiling. And then she was walking toward him. And boy could she walk. It was a sort of sachet, but he was trying his best not to stare at her hips. He dragged his gaze upward and was bowled over again by her smile. Boy howdy, but she was nice to look at. With all those curves, she reminded him of Botticelli's Birth of Venus, which seemed appropriate, given her name. He swallowed, reminded himself his parents had raised him to be a gentleman, then yanked his hat from his head. When she stopped in front of him, he smiled hopefully. I don't suppose you're Ms. Ditie Weston? To his surprise, she rolled her eyes. If I wasn't, I think I'd laugh, because that is such a ridiculous name. He tried to work through her reasoning. I don't know, ma'am. You do look as though you ought to be named after the goddess of love and beauty. When she cocked her head at him, Rhodey mentally kicked himself. Sorry, ma'am, he blurted, I shouldn't have said something so rude like that. I don't know, she murmured, her gaze dropping to where his hands clutched his hat in front of him. It was pretty forward, but it was a nice compliment too. Her eyes snapped back up to his, and before he could apologize again, or was she saying he didn't have to apologize, she smiled. I'm Ditie Weston, please call me that, instead of whatever name my sisters told you to use. In relief, he stuck out his hand. Rhodey Fellows, ma'am. Was it his imagination, or did she sigh slightly when she took his hand? Okay, Rhodey, let's get one thing straight. I dragged you across the country to do a favor for me, and yes, I'm paying, but not a truckload. The point is, I might be kinda your employer, but you're a friend of all of my new brother-in-laws. No, wait, brothers-in-law, right? The first word is plural? When she frowned in confusion, her lips pursed, Rhodey wondered how they'd taste. What was I saying? Sorry, ma'am. I got distracted. Ma'am. That was it. She shook her head. My point was, please just call me Ditie. Not ma'am, I mean. We're stuck together for a week, and it'd be awkward to be ma'aming each other left and right, although I guess I'd be Sir Ingu. You'd be silly as a ma'am. She blew out a breath. I'm making a mess of this. He didn't mind. He was enjoying just watching her. Are you saying you think the next week would be easier if we forego formalities and just consider each other friends? Yes, thank you. She threw up her hands in exasperation. This adventure will be so much easier if you just figure out what it is I'm trying to say. Grinning more easily now, he jammed his hat back on his head and glanced at the carousel behind her. Got it. Learn telepathy. I'll work on it before we leave, Ditie. To his surprise, she stuck her tongue out at him. And that caused all sorts of reactions in him. In your pants, more like, cowboy. Reactions in his pants? What was this, middle school? I think you should know, Rhodey, that I haven't met a single one of my brothers-in-law. Got it right that time, see, in person. Well, except Wyatt, like, years ago, but that isn't the point. But I know and love my sisters, and I'm certain the men they chose to marry aren't complete nincompoops. She seemed to be waiting for him to agree, so he did. Wyatt, Blake, Seth, and Aaron are all good guys. Right, and they all say you're a stand-up guy too. So I've decided to believe him. And instead of being all awkward around you, I'm going to treat you like a friend. Deal? She was staring up at him with those pale blue eyes, a little furrow of concentration between her brows making her look even cuter. And Rhodey didn't bother hiding his teasing grin. Deal. I think we're going to get along just fine, Ditie. She nodded, as if glad to get that out of the way, then turned slightly to peer at the luggage carousel. Now, where's your suitcase? He stepped up beside her. This is the 4th time it's gone by, he said, as he pointed at his duffel bag, one of the few remaining pieces of luggage. With a roll of her eyes, she huffed out a breath. Well, grab it, and let's get going. We still have to go shopping to stock up on food. As promised, you're going to have to help me fill the fridge, because I have no idea what people eat while RVing, and we've got a big day ahead of us. Tomorrow was the closing on her aunt's house, and they were going to leave right after lunch. He'd planned out their route and stops and had texted it to her to get her approval, and suddenly, Rhodey couldn't wait to get started. He grabbed his bag and straightened, the lazy grin back on his lips. Well, Ditie? Are you ready for your adventure? It was the right thing to say, judging from the way her eyes lit up. And right then and there, Rhodey promised himself he'd do everything in his power to make her smile like that again as often as possible. Chapter 2. Ditie somehow managed to keep her cool all the way to the grocery store. She liked to talk in the car, which had always driven her twin brother mad, so she spent the drive pointing out things of interest to her passenger and filling him in on some of the local history. The grocery store was actually one of those big box stores with all the departments, but she'd taken to shopping there because the groceries were cheap. I guess that won't be a problem anymore. Aunt Gertie had made certain of that, and Ditie still wasn't sure how she felt about her new situation. No, it's an adventure, remember? So what kind of food did you have in mind? Rhodey asked, as he unfolded his tall frame from her little hatchback, the back seat of which was packed to the brim with boxes from Gertie's house. She shrugged and tossed her bag over her shoulder. Honestly, I'm not much of a cook. I've gotten really good at making bland soups and puddings and stuff my great-aunt liked to eat, but that's about it. He was quiet for a moment, then glanced her way as they stepped through the automatic doors. I'm sorry for your loss. I know that sounds trite, and it's not like I knew her. But your sisters told me about how you'd been here taking care of her, so I know you must have been close to her. It was the gentleness in his voice which surprised Ditie, and she felt her throat tighten with emotion. Thank you, she managed. Blinking, she looked away, distracting herself as she pulled a cart from the line and used the sanitizing wipes on the handle and sides. She was a neat lady and fought really hard up until the end. Arya told me you two had always had a special bond. Ditie nodded as they headed toward the dairy section at the back of the store. She was my mom's aunt and had never had any children of her own. She and I just had a connection, even after she moved here. When she got so sick, it made sense for me to be the one to move out and take care of her. I'd just finished college and didn't have any work lined up. He nodded beside her. What did you go to college for? General ed, or so it seemed. She managed a chuckle. I focused on writing, which is useful in my blogging, but I took a bunch of business courses too. That sounds even more useful. I hope so. Not really sure what my plans are, beyond getting back to Montana in one piece. Grinning, he nudged the cart toward the milk. That's where I come in, I guess. I'll get you there, safe and sound. But let's start with what we're going to eat. Since you're not a cook and aren't used to camping, I can plan the menu. You just shout out what you don't like before I pick it, okay? Ditie kind of liked the warm feeling which rushed through her veins at the way he was taking charge. After being Gertie's caretaker for so long, she had to admit it felt nice to have someone else taking care of her for a change. Okay, she said softly, trying not to blush much. Milk? He reached into the freezer for a half-gallon. I drink 2% in my coffee, so speak now, or forever hold your peace. I pour 2% on my morning cereal. Well, okay then, he drawled, placing the milk in the cart. We're off to a good start. They quickly picked out a variety of lunch meat and cheese, as well as bread and other staples. There was some disagreement over crunchy peanut butter or smooth, but she won when she pointed out she ate PB and JS, and he didn't. Bacon was a must, because, well, bacon, and he grabbed some eggs too. Are you sure we can cook all this stuff? He seemed surprised. Standing there in the bread aisle, trying to decide between potato buns and sweet buns, his brows shot up. Sure. Anything you can cook, or I guess, anything I can cook, at home, you can cook in an RV. That's what makes them so ideal. Crock-pot meal? Sure. Casseroles in the oven? Sure. He shrugged. Do you like potato or sweet buns? Unable to help herself, her eyes dropped to the way his rear end filled out his jeans. Sweet buns. He snorted softly and tossed them into the cart. Me too. With a wink, he jerked his head toward the meat department. Let's go pick out some burgers. I'm going to teach you all about cooking over a campfire. By the time we get back to Caudron Valley, we'll have to call you Cookie. Ditie managed not to say anything else double entendre during the meat selection, but it was close. When he grabbed the breakfast sausage, she had to actually turn away and stare up at the ceiling in order to refrain from teasing him about handling his sausage. But judging from his smirk, she wondered if he could read her mind. Well, he promised to learn telepathy before we left. You should test him. It couldn't hurt. So on their way to the cleaning products aisle, Ditie let her eyes skim over him. Heaven help her, but the man was built exactly the way she liked them. He looked out of place in that hat and those boots here in Charleston, but she was a Montana girl at heart, and he was positively swoon-worthy. Those rough hands of his were wrapped around the cart handle, and she shivered suddenly, picturing them against her skin. I wonder how he kisses? The way he stopped suddenly in front of the toilet paper display, swinging around to face her, jerked her guilty gaze back up to his. And when she saw the heat in those chocolatey brown eyes, she wondered if maybe he could read her mind. And if he could, would he like what she was thinking? Would he be interested in kissing her back? Focus. Just because he's hot, doesn't mean you get to ogle him. He's not here for your enjoyment, he's here to do a job. A job she was paying him for. Toilet paper, she blurted, latching onto anything as a distraction, then darting around him to pull 2 packages from the display. Should I go with 6 jumbo rolls of TP, or 8 mega rolls? He cleared his throat. The 8 is a better deal, I guess. No. See? Because 6 jumbo rolls equal 10 regular rolls. Nodding, he pulled another package off the shelf, but 12 mega rolls equal 24 regular rolls. She was frowning now, trying to do the math. Well, calculating toilet paper absorbency has a way of cooling all those sexy thoughts, I guess. If 12 mega rolls equal 24 regular rolls, then 8 mega rolls, ooh. Look, there's double mega rolls in this pack. They're extra fluffy, it says. How many regular rolls do they equal? He asked blandly. It doesn't say. What is a regular roll, anyhow? I dunno. I think they stopped selling them when the marketing directors found the thesaurus and started finding synonyms for big. Smiling, he slid his package back onto the shelf, then took the toilet paper she was holding and put it away too. But it doesn't matter, because we don't need this stuff for the RV. He jerked his chin down the aisle and she followed, confused. See, in the RV, he said, reaching for a small 4-pack of rolls, we need the thin stuff. If the paper is too thick, it can clog the pipes. So we need this 1-ply stuff, though they don't advertise it like that. I wonder if these are regular rolls, she mused, taking it from him and tossing the package in the cart. He was grinning as he led the way toward the rubber gloves. I'm grabbing a pack of these for when we have to dump the sewage, okay? I think I can squeeze into a size large, which should fit you too. I'm going to teach you how to do it, so you can go RVing on your own when we get back to Montana. Ditie was staring at his hands as they sorted through the sizes. Okay, she murmured, bemused, thinking about what those hands would look like crammed into rubber gloves, and feeling a bit disappointed for some reason. Surprisingly, the conversation about sewage, cleaning products, and toilet paper didn't make him any less appealing. And again, she was happy to let him take the lead through the rest of the shopping. I'm grabbing 2 packs of marshmallows, he declared, when they'd reached the sweets aisle. I dunno how you feel about them, but if we're going to roast them, I can eat a whole pack by myself. Oh. Ditie smiled at a sudden memory. Can we make s'mores? I haven't been camping since I was a little girl, but I can remember my big brothers making them for me. Sure, he drawled, that sexy little smirk back on his lips. And I'll teach you some other tricks when it comes to campfire treats. The way his gaze dropped to her lips, just for a moment, made her wonder what kind of treat he had in mind. Should we talk about sleeping arrangements? The way she blurted the question made her wince. I mean, in general. Not because you were talking about s'mores or anything. Well, I'm glad to know talking about my desserts doesn't make you tired. He was teasing her, but there was something in his eyes which told her he wasn't thinking about being tired any more than she was. Maybe she'd turned as bright red as she felt. Maybe it was the way her mouth was open, but she seemed incapable of saying anything else. Whatever it was, he took pity on her. The Tiffin Breeze has a couch, right? I figured I'd bunk down there, while you took the bedroom. That had been her thought too, and she was relieved she didn't have to have an awkward conversation, more awkward, rather, about it. Should we go check out the camping supplies for a sleeping bag, or? Nah, he drawled, pushing the cart for the produce section. I brought my own. You didn't think that duffel was all clothes, did you? He grinned over his shoulder at her. If you can lend me a pillow, I think I'll be good to go. Oh. He'd done his research, anticipated the awkwardness, and had already figured out the best solution. Maybe he is telepathic. I can lend you a pillow, she managed to croak. She had plenty. As he picked out fruits and veggies, with her input, she realized one thing she really liked about Rhodey Fellows, and that was the fact he took the time to explain what he was thinking, or how he was making his decisions. She knew nothing about RVing, despite inheriting one, but by the end of their shopping trip, she felt like she understood a bit more, thanks to him. An adventure, Ditie. How about snacks? He asked, pushing the cart toward the chip and popcorn aisle. Rhodey, she said, trying for a serious tone, everyone knows that the only way for a road trip to be successful is to walk down the snack aisle and choose one of everything. So, chips and popcorn? She grinned, pulling packets off the shelf. And nuts and candy and chocolate. Ooh. Kit Kats. Chuckling, he joined her in grabbing the junk food. All in all, she was feeling pretty good about her decision. Rhodey was good-looking, sure, but more than that, her sisters had been right to suggest him. He definitely sounded as if he knew what he was doing, and she really appreciated that, while he was taking charge, he was also making sure she understood his decisions so she could fend for herself. A smidge of a thought of a possibility of a plan had begun to form, since she'd heard him explain so much. If the next week went well, and if she really did start to understand how to RV on her own, could she? Thanks to Aunt Gertie, she didn't have to worry about getting a job right away. She could do her blogging and charity work from anywhere with an internet connection or self-service. Could she eventually RV on her own? She pictured herself jaunting around the country, laptop in hand, viewing the world the way she'd always wanted to. Adventuring. Whoa, you're getting ahead of yourself. Maybe you should learn how to dump the poop water before you decide you're totally self-sufficient. Wrinkling her nose, Ditie decided her subconscious had a point. Better to see how the next week went before she started making plans. She and Rhodey got into their first argument when they tried to check out. The line was long, and they hadn't even reached the conveyor belt when he reached for his wallet. Hang on there, cowboy, she declared, noticing. I'm paying for all this. As a gentleman, I should. Are you trying to use chivalry on me, mister? Remember who hired you. He tried again. Most of this stuff I picked out. I would have been more frugal if I'd known you weren't going to let me pay for it. What if we split it? Look, Rhodey. She sighed as she pulled her messenger bag around to her front and opened the flap. I was in a pickle, yeah? When Aunt Gertie died and left me, well, everything, I was up to my ears in arrangements and details and all that. I'm selling the house, most of the furniture, and basically everything but the heirlooms and the RV. And my own stuff. Where the hell was that credit card? Frowning, she dug deeper. I had no idea how I was going to get that back to Montana because, frankly, the idea of driving that thing terrifies me. I'd heard of hiring drivers, but until Lainey suggested you, dang it, where's my card? Before he could respond, she thrust her bag into his arms. Oof. What's in this thing? Just the essentials, she muttered, pulling the flap wider and bending over, glad she could use both hands now. My point is, she declared, pulling out a stapler and placing it in the kiddie seating area of the cart, is that I owe you. I know I'm not paying you nearly enough for the job even with the airfare. So when I say room and board is included, that means paying for groceries. With a satisfied grunt, she pulled loose the sun visor from her car, which had gotten wedged at the bottom of the bag. Had the card fallen under that? Ooh, she muttered, holding up a corkscrew, I was looking for that. He hummed, and she could swear she heard the smile in his voice, when he said, Are you certain? I don't mind splitting the bills. I'm certain. I'm also paying for all the campsites and expenses, so get used to it. Is that a bagel? Without glancing up at him, she tossed it into the cart too. I like to be prepared. Just the essentials, huh? She growled slightly. Where did it go? Aha. Triumphantly, she held her dusty credit card aloft. And he was smirking at her. Don't you have a wallet? You know, to keep the essentials in? Scoffing, she tossed her stuff back into the bag, then took it from him. Don't be silly, that would just take up space. As they began to check out, she noticed him sending her bemused grins every once in a while. She didn't know what she'd said to amuse him, but decided she liked his smiles too much to care. Chapter 3. The next morning, Rhodey watched Ditie sell her Grey-Tant's house. He'd slept in the RV in the driveway and had been awakened by an apologetic Ditie, who had been moving the last loads of stuff out of the house. She was selling it with a lot of the furniture included, so it was mainly bedding and toiletries and a few last-minute kitchen supplies she needed to transfer. During their shopping excursion the previous night, and their fast food dinner because they were both too tired to cook after unloading all the groceries she'd purchased, he'd learned all about the house sale and everything else she'd done to prepare for today. She'd been living in Charleston for more than a year, caring for the old woman whom she'd been so close to. Aunt Gertie, as Ditie called her, had passed away almost a month ago. Ditie alone had handled the arrangements and the medical bills, as well as meeting with all the lawyers and everything including the estate business. It was a hell of a responsibility for someone he knew was only a few years younger than he was. Heck, he was a guy who lived in a bunkhouse on a ranch, and whose most prized possession was his truck. What did he know about responsibility? No, that wasn't fair. He'd been managing his investments, and even doing his own buying and selling of stocks on a small scale, for a few years now. It wasn't as if he were lazy or anything. But anyhow, she'd managed it all, and it had all culminated into today. Everything Gertie had owned now belonged to Ditie, and Rhodey was surprised how much that included. Not just the house and furnishings, but also the RV and all the silver and china currently packed carefully into the RV's storage compartments, plus the old woman's impressive life savings. Rhodey was crouched in front of her car, making sure the tow dolly was still properly connected to the RV's hitch, when she stepped out of the house, carrying only that outrageously full messenger bag she used as a purse. He stood, brushing his palms against the thighs of his jeans, wishing the South Carolina humidity was a little less ridiculous, and watched her insert the key into the lock and secure the house for the last time. It was the way her shoulders slumped that told him something was wrong. He started to head for her, and when she turned away from the door, he saw the tears on her cheeks. She stumbled coming down the porch, but he was there to catch her. Which was good, because as soon as she landed in his arms, she began to sob. From there, it seemed natural to wrap his arms around her, to press her cheek against his chest, to rest his chin atop her head, and let her cry. He'd been thinking about holding her since the moment he saw her in the airport yesterday, but not like this. This offering of comfort, hadn't been what he'd expected to do, but it was nice. It was nice to know he was there when she needed someone, and that she felt she could rely on him. Her hands were locked behind him, and her hold seemed kind of desperate as she sobbed against him, so he started to rub her back in small circles. Hey, it'll be okay, Ditie, I promise, he murmured soothingly. You're doing the right thing, and it'll be okay. He wasn't sure what other promises he made as he murmured to her. He wasn't trying to get her to stop crying, because he could tell she needed to cry. Had she broken down like this when her aunt had died? Or had she thought she needed to be strong? Why was she allowing him, a virtual stranger, to comfort her? Rhodey wasn't certain how long they stood there, her crying as she said her goodbyes to this part of her life, and him offering quiet assurances, but eventually, her tears subsided to hiccups, and he heard her whisper, "I'm sorry," against his chest. He smiled. Don't be. Please. He was just glad to be able to help. You have a right to cry, and I know your aunt would appreciate how much you love her. But think of it this way, you're about to embark on an adventure. Sucking in a surprised breath, she straightened, bumping his chin as she did. It stung, but he still smiled when he looked down into her confused expression. Her eyes were puffy, her cheeks red and raw, and she still looked damn good. What did you say? She whispered. What had he said? Something about. You're going on an adventure. An adventure, she breathed. And then, miracle of miracles, a smile slowly spread across her face. It wasn't a particularly bright one, but it was there, and Rhodey smiled as well, seeing it. He wasn't that useful during the actual settlement, which was over faster than he expected. Soon enough, Ditie was stepping back into the RV with an envelope full of papers in her hand, and a bemused look on her face. Rhodey swung around in the driver's seat, both captains' chairs swiveled, and offered her an encouraging nod. "All ready?" "I think so," she said, sliding into the passenger seat. She pulled her bag from over her head and dropped it between them, then took a deep breath. Yeah. Let's go have our adventure." Smiling, he slid the breeze into drive, and they left the lawyer's parking lot. The RV was a Class A, not the biggest he'd driven, but it still had all the bells and whistles. He'd been really impressed when he'd toured it last night, even though he knew the floor plan already. The vehicle had been well maintained and had a minuscule number of miles on it. As they pulled onto the highway, he decided to try to get her chatting about their trip. "This thing's only a few years old, right? It's in amazing shape." Despite her seatbelt, she was leaning forward in the passenger's seat, excitement in her eyes as she peered at the interstate ahead, a sight most people would have considered boring. "Yep. Aunt Gertie bought it new because she wanted to visit my second cousins in Virginia. She hired someone to drive it up there for her, and she parked in their driveway for 2 weeks, then she hired someone else to drive her back home. It's possible that's the only time it's been driven." He whistled, impressed. "And this is obviously a top-of-the-line model. It's made for 2 people to live in full-time, with all the storage and whatnot." Up front, right behind the swiveling captain's chairs, was a recliner and a couch he'd be sleeping on, and a desk nearby. There was a table with chairs, instead of the more common dinette, and the kitchen was huge. Then came the full bathroom, with plenty of space, and a big bedroom, with a queen bed in the back. When Aunt Gertie wanted something, she didn't go halfway. He glanced over at Ditie, hearing the melancholy in her tone. "She sounds as if she were a neat lady. I would have liked to meet her. Anyone who can pick out a beauty like this," he patted the dashboard, "really knew her stuff." They chatted some more about the RV, mostly of him sharing what he knew of the vehicle, and her listening intently. He liked that she was so determined to learn how to, not only drive the Tiffin Breeze, but how to hook it up and do all the other stuff associated with full-time RVing. "Are you thinking about living in here full-time?" She blushed and glanced down at her lap. "I don't know. I just knew I couldn't give it up, couldn't sell it, no matter how much it was worth. I mean, look at it." Swinging around, she gestured over her shoulder toward the interior of the vehicle. "This place is amazing, and it's all mine." She blew out a breath, then slumped in her seat. "I love to travel," she confessed in a soft voice. "During college, I studied all over the world, thanks to my scholarship. I even took a semester off and traveled around Scandinavia, all on my own." She brushed a hand over the dashboard in front of her, which he knew could fold down to become another desk. "I guess, when I realized Gertie was leaving me this, I was thinking about the possibilities for adventure," she finished in a whisper. "So do it." When he saw her glance at him, he nodded for good measure, then flicked on his turn signal to pass a slower tractor-trailer. "After we get home, why not move in here full-time and travel the country? Sounds like your aunt left you enough money to do that for a few years if you wanted." There was silence from the passenger seat. When he glanced at her, her brow was furrowed as if she were thinking hard, but she didn't speak. Mentally shrugging, he concentrated on getting the rig safely up I-26 toward Columbia. After a while, his stomach growled. They'd had lunch after the signing and weren't anywhere near the campsite yet. Chagrined, he shrugged when she looked over at him. "Sorry, I'm used to a mid-afternoon snack." Well, she twisted in her seat and peered behind her. "I guess that's the benefit of carting your house around with you like this." "You want chips, or something more substantial?" she asked, as she unbuckled her seatbelt. "How about a few of those cheese sticks and some nuts?" It was really cute the way she laid everything out on a little platter and placed it next to him on the console's table, before sliding into the passenger seat once more. "So how come you're so good at driving one of these?" Ditie asked, picking up one of the sticks of cheese and peeling a strip off. Do you have an RV back home? No, ma'am, he drawled. Ditie. He grinned, remembering how she'd felt in his arms that morning. Ditie, he agreed. Although I still think Aphrodite fits you just fine. She was blushing. Just answer the question, cowboy. No RV. I live on the Caudron Valley ranch in their bunkhouse. It's basically a dormitory for the single employees. The Caudrons have some houses on the property, but I don't need anything fancy. A comfy bed and a good truck, and I'm in heaven. Humming softly, she reached for an almond. And you, what? Herd cattle? Nope. He chuckled. If you can believe it, I don't even like horses, but I can drive and fix anything with wheels. The Caudrons hired me to keep their vehicles running, but they don't have more than a few dozen, so I do plenty of jobs on the side. I've even ferried a few RVs in my time, which is basically what I'm doing here. Except, he shot her a grin, never with the owner on board, and never one as pretty as you. Are you going to flirt with me all the way to Montana? He liked the way she was so darn direct. Would you mind? It was tough to keep his eyes on the road when she cocked her head and swept him with a calculating gaze, her eyes finally landing on his hands wrapped around the steering wheel. No, she said softly, I don't think I'd mind at all. Well, the way that comment made him feel carried him all the way through the upstate of South Carolina and into the mountains. They chatted about all sorts of things, swapping stories and anecdotes. He discovered she appreciated his sense of humor and tried his best to make her laugh as much as possible, and although their first campsite was already booked north of Asheville, since they were only going a few hours today, thanks to the midday closing, he was already wondering if he could drag this trip out longer than he'd originally planned. As they pulled into the Smoky Mountains, she had her phone out, snapping photos left and right, oohing and awing over each turn in the road. He thought it was adorable, considering she grew up near the Rockies, but he had to admit there was something different, timeless, almost, or more accessible, about the Smokies. Oh. The Blue Ridge Parkway, I've always wanted to see that. He winced, already apologizing. It runs north to south, and we're heading west. He hated the thought of disappointing her, so he hurried to offer, but if you want, we could hop on it here and reconfigure the agenda. She blew out a breath. No, that's too much trouble for this trip. Let's keep heading in the right general direction at least. She sounded determined as she pulled up the map on her phone again. But I'm going to have to come back someday. And in that moment, Rhodey realized he wanted to be with her then. He'd only known the woman for a day, and already he knew he wanted to be there when she drove the parkway for the first time, wanted to see her face light up with joy. I wish we could see some of these waterfalls up close, she murmured, still peering down at her phone, and he pressed his lips together to hide his knowing smile. He was rewarded by her gasp of delight when she saw the first campsite he'd booked for them. Oh, Rhodey! It's gorgeous. And he had to agree, although he was looking at her, not the scenery. When she grabbed his hand and tugged him toward the waterfall they were camping near, he was happy to follow along, wondering if she even realized what she'd done. Maybe she had, maybe she hadn't, but Rhodey was content to gently twine his fingers through hers and watch her exclaim over the waterfall. It wasn't until she reached for her phone that she seemed to realize what she'd done and stared at their joined hands for a moment too long, before letting go. But she didn't blush and didn't look as if she regretted the impulsive move, and that, more than anything else, filled him with peace. That evening, as she pulled out the folding chairs they'd found in one of the storage compartments along the outside of the breeze, Rhodey made a fire in the fire pit and slapped some burgers on the swinging grill. Ooh, campfire burgers, she asked, handing him a cold can from the fridge. Yep. From where he was crouched by the fire, he nodded toward the RV. The stove would have worked fine, of course, and you know there's that sweet outdoor kitchen and grill already connected to the vehicle's propane line. But there's just something about burgers grilled over a campfire. They shared a grin, and he added with a wink, plus, I needed the fire for dessert. They ate their burgers at the picnic table, and she was right, somehow, burgers grilled over an open campfire did taste better than propane grilled. Or maybe it was just the way she scarfed down the burger, humming and moaning in appreciation. And when she sucked the ketchup off the tip of her finger, Rhodey felt his throat go dry and his jeans get a bit tighter. Lord help him, but she was appealing. Not just in her looks, but in the enthusiastic way she tackled life. I want to make her burgers every Saturday night. I want to hold her hand when we discover every new waterfall. And wasn't that an interesting realization? S'mores time? She asked hopefully. He grinned. Absolutely. This is the first evening of your grand adventure, Ditie, and we're going to kick it off in style. With a little squeal, she stood from the table and started collecting plates. I'll clean up and find some marshmallow roasting sticks. I'll get the ingredients and start soaking the dishes. They worked well together, and in just a few minutes, they were back in front of the fire. With fresh drinks in hand, they settled into the camp chairs and began to roast their marshmallows. With a sigh, she planted her elbow on her bare knee and smiled happily at the campfire. This is what I want, Rhodey. A s'more? No, well, yes, but more than a s'more. 2 s'mores? Grinning, she rolled her eyes. It was already dusk, and he was finally glad he was wearing jeans to stay warm. She checked on her marshmallow, decided it wasn't done enough, and shoved it back near the coals. I want campfires and waterfalls and scenery. I want to see the country. You want adventure? Yeah. Almost shyly, she lifted her eyes to his. I want adventure. I can give you an adventure. But he didn't say it. It was too early, and too cheesy. Instead, he cleared his throat and jerked his chin toward the Tiffin breeze. You've got the means to do it. Imagine seeing the Grand Canyon in this baby. I can't drive it. I can't take care of it. I watched you do all the hookups today, and I still don't think I could do it. Well, he shrugged, we've got at least a week together, maybe more, depending on if you want to switch up the route. I'll make sure you learn everything you need to know. In case I can't be here with you. Maybe she heard the unspoken words, because instead of acknowledging his offer, she made a little sound and pretended great interest in her marshmallow. He swallowed. I'll get the chocolate and graham crackers. Luckily, constructing s'mores was a messy endeavor, and soon they were both distracted from whatever had passed between them. Laughing, they compared techniques, and soon, both of their hands and lips were sticky. It made him feel like a kid again, but she made him feel every inch a man. I've got enough for one more, she said, waving the last of the crackers as she began to unwrap the chocolate. Smiling, he leaned back in his chair to watch. Enjoy it. As she slid the marshmallow between the crackers, she shook her head. I'm stuffed. But we can't let it go to waste. You want it? He wasn't going to turn down a s'more. But to be polite, he said, this is your dream, you eat it. My dream isn't to get so sick on sugar, I barf all over my new RV. She waved the s'more back and forth. Are you sure I can't interest you in one more? She could interest him in a whole lot more. Come on, Rhodey. In the light from the banked fire, her eyes sparkled with teasing. Open up for the airplane. He laughed as she moved the s'more in big circles, drawing nearer his mouth. You really don't want it? He asked. I want you to have it. Open up. Here comes the airplane, she sang out, then made adorable whirring noises. He grinned. Runway number 3 is cleared for landing, he declared, then opened his mouth wide. Laughing, she leaned over and popped the s'more into his mouth. But she miscalculated, or maybe he did. Either way, she hadn't fully removed her hand before he closed his mouth, and his lips caught her fingertips. They both froze, him with a s'more and her fingers in his mouth, and her leaning toward him. When she exhaled, he swore he heard her moan, but then she pulled her finger from his mouth, with a soft pop. She tasted as good as he'd imagined, and that was just her fingers. Imagine what her lips would taste like. That imagining kept him up a lot later than he should have been, and he couldn't even blame the couch, because it was pretty comfortable. He was cramped on it, yeah, but if he rolled over on his side and propped his head up on the pillow, and folded his arms across his chest. Well, it wasn't exactly comfortable, and it sure as hell didn't do anything to distract him from the need coursing through his veins. One thing was certain, Ditie Weston had gotten under his skin, in the best kind of way. Chapter 4. On the first morning of her road trip, Ditie woke up in a delicious cloud of pillows. She'd moved her mattress topper with her into the RV, and it had totally been worth it. Besides, was life really worth living if you didn't have 10 pillows on your bed? Before she snuck into the bathroom, she peeked into the living area. Rhodey was still asleep on the couch, and he was snoring. She smiled. It was a nice sort of snoring, and wasn't that an interesting realization? That someone could snore nicely? No, it wasn't his snoring which was nice, it was the way it made her feel, contented. Happy. Like things were where they were supposed to be. She tried to tiptoe around the kitchen, making her morning tea, but he woke up anyhow. She propped her hip against the counter, wrapped her hands around her mug, and smiled at the way he sat up and scratched his messy hair, then yawned. Morning, she offered. Want some breakfast? Is it cereal? Ditie shrugged. I can manage cereal. I can also manage to scramble some eggs, if you show me how to work the stove. He kicked his way out of his sleeping bag, and she winced slightly, realizing his long frame must not have been nearly as comfortable as she'd been on the queen bed. How about you scramble the eggs, and I'll cook them when I get back, he asked, as he headed for the bathroom. So she did, and later, she watched him cook the eggs and bacon while his coffee brewed. She tried to stay out of his way, but loved how he took the time to explain everything to her as he did it. Maybe tomorrow she could try to cook him breakfast. They ate breakfast at the picnic table, the waterfall in front of them. She had to admit there was something really invigorating she hadn't expected about starting her day with some gorgeous nature and delicious food. And a gorgeous man. He sure was sexy first thing in the morning, huh? So what's on the agenda today? It was easier to talk about the current adventure than how good he looked in that t-shirt. Well, he drawled, chasing after the last of his eggs with his fork, I'd planned on making it to Paducah, Kentucky today. It's only about 6 hours from here, but that's still a long day's drive if you're not used to road trips. She already had her phone out, researching. Ooh, Paducah's the home of the National Quilt Museum. You like quilting? Not even a little bit. Well, she said with a shrug, I know nothing about it. But it's cool that there's an entire museum dedicated to quilting. He lifted a brow. So you want to visit the museum? Tell you what. It's the first full day of this road trip, so let's see how we do and what kind of nature we run into along the way. We can make the call about the quilt museum when we get there. Chuckling, he shook his head and reached for her plate to stack them. Sounds like a plan. Remember, this trip is all about you. You're the boss, so if you want to stop anywhere, or head off the path I've mapped out, just say the word. We can go anywhere you want. He turned to take the dishes into the RV without realizing how breathless he'd made her. We can go anywhere you want. It was the perfect thing to say to her, and it had been said by the sexiest man she'd ever met, who was currently making her a home in a RV. In that moment, Ditie fell a little bit in love. A little bit? Who are you kidding? It would be extremely easy to fall head over heels in love with Rhodey Fellows. They hung out at the waterfall for another hour or so. The cool thing about camping in the RV was she had all the comforts of home, but was able to hang out in the middle of some gorgeous nature. But alas, all good things must come to an end, and she was excited to get going. Who knew what kind of cool sights she was going to see in the coming days? We can go anywhere you want. She'd always wanted to see the Grand Canyon, but it was a little out of the way on this trip. Maybe next time. After a half hour on the road, she dug out her laptop and set it up on the little desk in the passenger side front seat. Rhodey was chewing on sunflower seeds, his left arm propped up on the windowsill. To her surprise, he listened to classical music as he drove, surprising, because she had him pegged as a country fan. So whenever one channel began to get staticky on the radio, he'd scan through the stations until he found another classical one. He also had a little CB radio laying up on the dashboard, from which occasional bursts of laughter or obscure calls would come through. It was jarring against the soothing tones of the classical, and when she asked about it, he shrugged. I like to know what's going on ahead of me. Truckers communicate, you just gotta speak their language. And you do? His lazy grin was his only answer. You know, she pointed out, our phones can tell us traffic and speed traps and all that too. She tapped the lid of her laptop. Yeah, but they're not as much fun. Besides, this way, I can keep my eyes on the road. It was hard to argue with that. Okay, but let me know if you want me to look up anything for you. She could easily check the maps or traffic or detours or whatever. Sure thing. His gaze cut sideways to her for a brief moment. What are you working on there? She hadn't expected his question. My blog. You blog? Oh, that's right, you said that before. It was a little embarrassing to admit her secret goals to him. Yeah. I started it in college when I traveled so much. Then, when I was backpacking around Sweden and Norway and Denmark, I ended up even getting some sponsors. My fans say I've got a fun way of looking at things. His brows went up, but he kept his attention on the road ahead, one calloused hand wrapped around the large steering wheel. How many readers do you have? She was secretly proud of her following, and when she mentioned the number, he whistled. She flushed, surprised by how pleased that made her feel. And getting sponsors is a big deal. But you said you used to write? He asked. When I went to live with Aunt Gertie, I kinda cut back. At first, I could write about funny stuff that happened and things she said, but toward the end, it wasn't funny at all. Ditie swallowed, not wanting to remember the last few months. Besides, it's a travel blog, and I hadn't done any traveling since I went to live with her. He hummed, then patted the dashboard fondly. You know, if you decide to keep this baby, not only would you be able to travel all over the place, but you could write about everywhere you've been. There's lots of cool accounts and channels devoted to RVing. We can go anywhere you want. The little bubble of excitement she'd felt when she'd heard those words was back in her stomach, making her feel lighter. I know. She tried to tamp down on her giggle, but it was hard. Today, I want to write about camping last night and what it was like. I'll let it sit for a day or two, then come back and tweak it before I post. It feels so good to be writing again. She sighed happily, her gaze straying out the front window. Writing about traveling again. I'm glad, Ditie. When she snuck a glance at him, he wasn't looking at her, of course, but he was smiling, and the sight of it filled her with a sort of contentment she hadn't expected. When she finished up the first draft of her post, she saved it to read over later and pulled up her work emails. She had a minor role on the board of a charity, and while her position had taken a back burner over the last year while she cared for her great-aunt, she was looking forward to being able to work with them again. Vaguely, she was aware of the scenery changing. After Knoxville, the beautiful rolling hills of Tennessee took her breath away, everything was so green. East of Nashville, they stopped for a quick lunch at a rest area. It was so cool not to have to worry about fast food or anything, since they had their kitchen with them, and she put aside her laptop to gawk at the country music capital. Rhodey occasionally fiddled with the knobs on the CB or changed channels on the radio. He'd settled on one, but it was in the middle of one of their seasonal pledge drives. And then, halfway through Nashville, traffic started to slow down. Muttering under his breath, Rhodey eased the RV into the right lane behind a tractor-trailer as they crept along. He glanced in the side mirror and reached for the CB radio. Tanker yanker coming up fast, driver. Apparently, he spoke another language. What? Blurted Ditie. The radio crackled. What's the hold up? Come back. Rhodey lifted the CB to his lips again. No idea. I'm keeping my head down. There was a burst of laughter from the radio, then a voice said something about four-wheelers, which made Rhodey smile. Are you speaking trucker? He grinned. Yes, ma'am. It's a dying language. What's a tanker yanker? He nodded up the road where another truck had sped past them, only to be stuck in traffic farther up the road. A tanker driver. But that makes more sense. Why not just call it that? He shrugged and flashed her a quick grin. Redundancy. Don't want anyone to have to guess what you just said. Are you kidding? She threw up her hands in exasperation. Everything you just said was indecipherable. This time he chuckled. When we're sitting like this, it's good to have a hobby. Blowing out a breath, she slouched in her seat. I hate being stuck in traffic. Nah, he drawled. We're not in traffic. We are traffic. She frowned, considering his words. That's surprisingly deep. I'm a surprisingly deep man. Well, it's either really deep or full of. Hey now, he interrupted, let's not go saying things we can't take back. She burst into laughter. Teasing him was fun. At that moment, a car cut in front of them, squeezing in between the breeze and the truck ahead. Rhodey cursed under his breath and braked, only to have the car zip into the other lane again, to pass the truck. Well, that guy's going places, Rhodey muttered. She watched the car get stuck 2 vehicle lengths ahead. Not, very far. But places. Yeah, like jail, if he keeps driving like that. She chuckled again, and when she caught Rhodey's eye, he was grinning too. You want anything to eat? She asked suddenly. He waggled the bag of sunflower seeds he'd propped up in the door beside him. I'm not hungry, I just munch on these because they're good brain food. Sliding out of the passenger seat, she threw over her shoulder, oh yeah, and what do you have to think about, as she reached the kitchen cabinets. You want any chocolate? Heck yes, I want some chocolate. What do you have? With the RV moving so slowly, it was easy to walk back up to the cab holding the bags of mini chocolate bars. I've got Snickers and Kit Kats. Hook me up with some Kit Kats please. She obliged, peeling the bag open. You got the lyrics wrong. It's break me off a piece of that. Haha, he interrupted blandly, reaching for the bag. I'm not a singer, so what were you thinking about? He waited until he'd finished chewing his first piece of candy, then nodded to the radio. I was thinking that if the host came on to tell us about the pledge drive one more time, and how much money they have left to raise within this hour, I was going to have to do something drastic. And I was thinking about a few of my investments I need to tweak. She latched onto the first part of what he'd said. What do you mean by drastic? She asked, rebuckling her seatbelt. Well, if this dude won't just play my driving music, I might. I dunno, driving music? She snorted. Who listens to classical while driving? His offense was clearly faked. Hey, it's soothing. Well, God forbid you have to change the channel. Look, Ditie, public radio is an important service. It's paid for by listeners like you and me. His words were serious, but his tone was teasing. Okay, Mr. Public Service. You could just listen to your CB radio instead. Pretending to be hurt, Rhodey sniffed and reached for the little CB. Maybe I will. He lifted it in front of his lips. Hey driver, you got your ears on? Wanna explain to my passenger what the point of these? Squealing, she lunged for the CB and pulled it from his hands. He burst into laughter, and although she thought he hadn't pressed the little button to broadcast, she wasn't certain. Holding it against her lap, she peered out the big front window to the truck ahead. Now that traffic was easing up, we're not in traffic, we are traffic, she could see more tractor trailers ahead of them. Did they hear you? Are they laughing at me? Rhodey was still chuckling. No, sweetheart, they're not laughing at you, they're laughing with me. She turned to glare at him, but the endearment snuck up on her. Sweetheart. She'd known the man only 2 days, and maybe he called all the ladies he knew sweetheart. But something about him told her that wasn't true. Something told her Rhodey liked her as much as she was beginning to like him. Shyly, a grin spread across her face. Without looking at her, he held out his hand as he checked his side mirror and accelerated. Give me that back. No one actually heard me, I promise. At that moment, she didn't care if some faceless truckers had heard him tease her, because he'd called her sweetheart. She slid the CB back into his hand, and when his fingers closed around it, hers were caught as well. She remembered the feel of his lips around her fingertips last night, and that same desperate warmth spread up her arms and settled into her belly. And lower. Who knows what might have happened, what she would have said. But she didn't have the chance, because at that moment, the host on the classical music station came back on. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to our summer pledge drive. I'm your host. Hissing in irritation, Rhodey pulled his hand from hers and plopped the CB on the dashboard. Then he reached for the console, where his phone and wallet were stored. He handed her the phone without looking at her. Do me a favor. When he repeats the phone number yet again, call it, would you? Ditie's brows raised, but sure enough, the host repeated the number, and she dutifully dialed it. Was this what he'd meant when he'd said he was about to do something drastic? She handed the phone back to Rhodey, and he shoved it into the crook of his shoulder, his eyes still on the interstate ahead of him. They were leaving Nashville, so she didn't know how much longer they'd even be listening to this station. Yeah, hey, I'm calling to make a pledge. He paused, obviously listening to someone on the other end of the phone. Ditie shifted in her seat, surprised to see he considered making a pledge as doing something drastic. Rhodey was nodding now. Uh-huh. And how much do you need in order to meet your goal for the hour? When the person on the other end of the phone said something, he whistled. And you'll go back to playing music after you get that amount? This was seriously his plan? Well, okay then. I figure I've got just a little bit of driving before I'm out of your broadcast range. If you can promise me you'll play Tchaikovsky's complete 1812 overture, starting within the next 2 minutes, I'll pledge the whole amount. He paused. Yes, ma'am, $850, but I want the song. You can do that? Well, all right, he drawled. I'll pass you off to my assistant. Grinning, he glanced at Ditie as he held the phone out to her. There's a gray credit card in my wallet, you know, a wallet, where you can keep important stuff, so it doesn't get lost in big bags. Anyhow, read off the numbers to this nice lady, would you, Ditie? In a daze, Ditie took the phone from him. Did he seriously just pledge $850 just to get the host to quit talking? Hello, she asked, as she fumbled with the wallet and pulled out his card, not even minding the way he'd teased her. It was short work to read off the numbers and relay important information such as his billing address and email for the tax deduction receipt. Then she hung up and turned incredulous eyes to him. Why? Smiling, Rhodey leaned forward and turned up the radio, just as the iconic opening bars of Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture began to play. Because this song is 15 minutes long. And it's one of my favorites. I figure we'll be reaching the edge of broadcast range by the time this one is done. No, I mean, $850? That's a lot, Rhodey, is it? He shrugged as he glanced over at her, then settled his eyes on the road ahead. What am I going to do with it? And public radio stations need it. I'm enjoying their product, and they're playing one of my favorite songs. So why shouldn't I spend it? Wide-eyed, she settled back against the passenger seat, still not certain she believed what had just happened. Why not? He'd asked. He'd acted as though money wasn't that big of a deal. But, he was a mechanic. She knew that. She knew what he'd told her about his job back in Caudron Valley and what her sisters had relayed. He was a mechanic, but he hadn't blinked at pledging such a large amount of money to something she didn't consider all that worthy of a cause. But maybe he did. If that was the case, she definitely shouldn't ask him about it again and interrupt as he listened. It might have been the longest piece of music in creation, or near enough, but apparently, it was worth $850 to him. So she would shut up and enjoy it with him. Chapter 5. They never did go to the National Quilt Museum. That was okay, because Ditie had other things to look forward to. Rhodey let her do the hookups that evening, and she was really proud of herself to learning how to manage that aspect of RV camping. The next morning, she helped cook breakfast too, and he teased her an awful lot, which made her feel all warm and squishy inside. He also called her sweetheart again, which made her feel even better. They'd been driving for an hour when she looked at the map. We're heading through St. Louis, right? Yep. He was munching on sunflower seeds again. Although we can go a different route if you'd prefer. You're the boss. St. Louis sounds great. I've always wanted to see the arch. You've never seen it? He shot her a surprised glance. We can stop if you want. She peered at him, surprised by his surprise. I don't need to stop. Have you seen it? Sure. My father grew up in St. Louis and is a die-hard Cardinals fan. Under 2 days' worth of scruff, which, hello? Sexy as hell, his lips pulled into a lazy grin. Although don't talk to us about the Rams, huh? How'd he end up in Montana? Rhodey's fingers tapped out a beat on the steering wheel. Met my mom in college and followed her home. They're both working over at the university in Missoula. So you visited St. Louis a lot growing up? Yep. My Nana still lives in the area. She gasped and shifted in her seat until she was facing him. You were going to drive right through, without stopping to see your Nana? His brows drew in when he cut his eyes her way briefly. I'm working. She'll understand. Well, I don't, huffed Ditie. She's your Nana, of course we have to stop and visit her. Slowly, Rhodey turned his face to her, even if his eyes stayed on the road. You're serious? You want me to stop? I want us to stop. She clucked her tongue. Honestly, Rhodey, family is really important. Think of how she'd feel if she found out you drove right through without visiting. Yes, we have to stop, if she's okay with it, and, she bit down on the embarrassing confession that she wanted to know all about him, then finished shyly. And I'd like to meet her. He was quiet for a moment, then drawled with a shake of his head, well, okay then. They pulled over at a rest area and called his grandmother, who was thrilled at the opportunity to see him. She invited them to her home for a late lunch, and Ditie smiled when Rhodey accepted for them both. And as they drove through St. Louis, he slowed down so she could gawk up at the arch and vowed to herself she'd come back to go up inside of it. The thought tickled at the back of her head that Rhodey must visit the city to see his family, so maybe she could come back with him. On the way through the city on I-64, he pointed out Busch Stadium where the Cardinals play, named after the famous St. Louis beer, and Enterprise Center where the Blues National Hockey League team played. And then they were through the city, and she was surprised by how fancy some of the places west of St. Louis were. The exit he took, and it was a little scary to see how well he handled the long RV and towed car on that tight clover leaf, led them to a quiet area called Frontenac, with big houses behind gates and long drives. Ditie frowned, getting more and more confused. He was a mechanic, wasn't he? Just because he works with those beautiful hands, doesn't mean his family isn't well off. Don't be old-fashioned or make assumptions. He's his own man and can go his own way. Right. But, why hadn't he told her? Why had he let her think he was just a simple mechanic? She had to remind herself it wasn't her business when he stopped in front of one of the fanciest houses she'd ever seen and sent her a grin. Let's go see Nana. The door was opened by a rotund young woman who beamed at them and told them, Mrs. Fellows is in the dining room. His Nana has a servant? Is it a butler? Can women buttle? What kind of person? And then Ditie stopped thinking, because her brain had dropped its mouth open and was staring around her in awe. The house was gorgeous and was filled with all sorts of delicate and expensive-looking things. Carved banisters, crystal vases, paintings on the wall in thick gold frames. He's a mechanic. Ditie was getting uncomfortably warm, and it had nothing to do with the temperature or the way Rhodey was smiling. No, in fact, his easy grin was making her even more irritated. Yes, that was it, she was irritated. Rhodey, an elegant gray-haired woman called, as she stood from the dining room table. I've missed you, my love. He managed to look completely at home in his jeans and cowboy boots and t-shirt, although he'd taken off his hat before wrapping the woman in a crushing hug. She was laughing happily as he told her about his trip thus far. When he introduced Ditie as his friend and employer, Nana just hummed speculatively and invited them to sit. Ditie should have been nervous as hell, eating simple chicken salad off china plates with, was this fork real silver, but somehow, Rhodey's grandmother managed to set her at ease and was full of stories about Rhodey, his sisters, and their father. Oh my, yes. My daughter-in-law is a botanist, don't you know, and my oldest granddaughter takes after her. Dear Camilla has a doctorate now, studying down in Texas. Next comes Maggie, Magnolia, and she takes after my son, being far more interested in art and architecture. Rhododendron is the only one who works with his hands, but his grandfather was so proud of him. That's how my husband had made his fortune, you know. With his own 2 hands. Ditie choked on her chicken. Scrambling for her water goblet, she saw Rhodey's face go red. Rhododendron, she managed to gasp out, in between sips of water. Rhodey glared at her. His grandmother was beaming happily, so Ditie cleared her throat. Rhodey, you never mentioned, you have sisters? She finished weakly, realizing he didn't want to talk about his name. He seemed to relax slightly, although his cheeks were still flushed. Well, no wonder. She'd assumed Rhodey was short for Rhodes, but Rhododendron was a million times worse. Of course, with older sisters named after flowers, she supposed it made sense for him to get a family name. Part of her wanted to tease him, but part of her was still irritated. She'd thought he was a cowboy, a man who worked with his hands. Having a name like Rhododendron Fellows made him sound as if he belonged in a world with crystal and silver and servants who buttled. They managed to make it through the rest of the meal without any more embarrassing tidbits, but Ditie did learn why she was surrounded by so much luxury. Apparently, Rhodey's grandfather had made his fortune in candy. Honest-to-goodness candy. Oh, yes, dear. Practically anything made from sugar, his company sold. He and his father even invented a few of the most popular ones. Nana went on to list some candies Ditie was very familiar with. Her jaw dropped open. Are you kidding? Seriously? She swung to face Rhodey. I practically lived on that stuff when I was a kid. It explained her, rather more abundant than was popular curse these days. I probably put your sisters through college. And Rhodey too, dear, Nana interrupted. He has a degree in business from Washington University. Oh wow. A prestigious degree from a prestigious school. One more revelation in a string of revelations. Ditie closed her mouth and turned her attention to the remains of her lunch, her irritation turning to hurt. Why hadn't he told her any of this? Why would he? You've only known him a few days, and it's not as if you're best friends or anything. Yeah, but they've been living together. You're just hurt because you thought there was something between the two of you. And now she'd found out he'd hidden so much of himself from her, she realized that wasn't true. Damn it, she hated when her subconscious was right. The afternoon's drive was quiet. Too quiet. For Rhodey, who'd gotten used to the teasing banter he'd been sharing with Ditie, it was rough. Every time he'd glance over at her in the passenger seat, she would avoid his gaze. She spent most of the time with her arms crossed in front of her chest, staring out the window. Occasionally, she even got up and moved back to the living area, although he couldn't see what she was doing back there. As much as he loved Nana, he wished she hadn't spilled the beans about his real name. If she hadn't, Ditie wouldn't be avoiding him like this. Wait, what? Ditie's smart. She's not going to push you away over your stupid name. Well, what else could it be? Who'd ever heard of a cowboy named Rhododendron? I knew I should have changed my name years ago, but it'd hurt Mom's feelings, so he hadn't. He'd just let everyone think his name was Rhodes, which suited him much better, considering his love of vehicles. If Ditie was angry at him for another reason, he sure couldn't figure it out. A few times he asked her questions, but she'd respond with one-word answers, so he quit trying and just munched on his snacks and listened to his classical music. By dinner time, they still weren't to Kansas City, which had been his destination before the unexpected visit to Nana's. But he also wasn't sure he felt like stopping early, not if Ditie was going to continue to glare at him. You want to stop now, Ditie? Or just grab some fast food and push on to the campground? Whatever, she mumbled, not even looking at him. So, stifling a sigh, he pulled off the highway just long enough to grab a bunch of fast food tacos, a few of which he ate with one hand while driving, which led to dropping bits of lettuce and tomato all over his crotch. Yesterday, he would have sent her a suggestive wink and asked if she wanted to help him clean it up. Today, well, he wasn't sure where he stood with her. They finally reached the campground, and he took care of the hookups in the dark. In fact, she hadn't come out of the RV at all, so he was frowning when he pushed open the door and found her sitting at the dinette table, staring at her laptop. He didn't think she was actually looking at the document she had pulled up. "Hey," he said, trying for a nonchalant tone. "Do you want a fire again tonight?" She didn't look up from her laptop. "No." With a sigh, he scrubbed his hand over his face. "Ditie." Her ice blue gaze cut toward him. "Yes, Rhodey?" "Damn it, is that what all this is about?" Reaching for the laptop lid, she closed it with a snap. "All what?" "All," he waved his hand between them, "this. You've been irritated with me since you met my Nana. What's up with that? Is it because of my stupid name? You think I like being named after a flower? And not even a cool flower either." She was frowning at him. "Rhododendrons are beautiful. We saw some beside the waterfall in the Smokies, remember?" Rolling his eyes, he threw up his hands and turned away. "Oh, great. Well, since the flower's beautiful, that makes me feel so much better." When he felt her touch on his forearm, he was startled enough to jerk away from her, although that was the last thing he'd wanted to do. He twisted to stare down at her. When had she stood up? And why were her lovely eyes so full of uncertainty? "Rhodey, I don't care what your name is, really. I should just call you Rhode because it fits you so much better." That'd be almost as silly, like calling her Ditie when Aphrodite, the goddess of love and desire, was so damn perfect for her. But he hesitated, wondering at her words. "You don't care I'm named after a flower?" "As long as you don't care, my whole family is full of crazy stupid names. Did I tell you we're all named after Greek myths, and all our names start with as? My twin is named Adonis, for Lord's heaven's sake." He shook his head, still uncertain what the heck had just happened. "If you're not irritated by my name, then, why have you been so upset with me all afternoon?" With a noise very much like a groan, Ditie turned away and rubbed at her face. With her back to him, she blew out a breath, and he saw her shoulders slump. "So much for learning how to read my mind," she muttered. "I wasn't upset, Rhodey. I was hurt." He'd hurt her? The knowledge slammed into his chest, and he instinctively reached for her before he'd even really understood what he was doing. "Wah, Ditie, when did I hurt you?" Still not looking at him, she muttered, "When you lied to me." While he was processing that, and trying to figure out what the hell she was talking about, she stomped across the kitchen to pull open the pantry and reach for the cute little basket with all their snacks in it. "When did I lie to you, sweetheart?" Glaring at him now, the flash had only come after he'd called her sweetheart, so that might have been a mistake. She propped her hip against the counter and angrily unwrapped a chocolate bar. "You told me you were a mechanic at Caudron Valley Ranch. You dress like..." She waved the bar at him, managing to encompass his boots and his shoulders, but her gaze lingered much longer on his hands for some reason. "You dress like a cowboy. But you're not just a mechanic, are you?" "Sure I am. I've been working for the Caudrons for years." With a snarl, she shoved the rest of the chocolate bar in her mouth, and he propped his hands on his hips, wondering what in the hell he'd done now. "Ditie, I didn't lie. I promise." "Okay," she mumbled around the snack, then swallowed and tried again. "Okay. You didn't outright lie, but you didn't exactly tell me the truth, did you?" Totally lost now, Rhodey shrugged. "Truth about what?" "About you." She stepped forward, one finger stretched as if she wanted to poke him in the chest. "You've got a fancy degree. So do you. And you spend money like it's no big deal, and you come from, bah." She threw up her hands. "Crystal and Silver and butlers, and, Anne. Lucia isn't a butler, Ditie. She's been with Nana for years." "That's not the point." He shook his head. "And who cares about the crystal and silver? You've got boxes of the stuff locked in the storage compartment in the back." "That's not mine, it's Aunt Gertie's." "It's yours now. And the stuff Nana uses belongs to her, not me." "You don't get it." Growling, she stepped forward, tilting her head back, to glare up at him. You're not just a simple mechanic. From the moment I clapped eyes on you, I've been totally and completely enamored with this simple cowboy look you've got going on. You're hot, Rhodey, as if you didn't know. Do you know how often I've imagined kissing you? Touching you? And now it turns out that you're not at all who I thought you were. Incredulous, he blew out a harsh bark of laughter. You've imagined kissing me? Ditie, I'd barely been able to keep my hands off you, and now you're telling me you think my nana matters. She grabbed his shirt and pulled him closer, and he did the rest. Instinctively, his hands went to her hips, pulling her flush against him, and lowered his lips to hers. God in heaven, she tasted as good as he'd imagined. Chocolate and anger and laughter and chocolate. With a groan, he swept his tongue across her lips, and when they opened, he caught her moan and matched it. The kiss started full of fury, hot and desperate, but by the time he realized what he was doing, it had settled into a sort of steady pulse which had him aching with need. He realized, somehow, he'd backed her against the counter, and she'd shimmied atop it. Now she sat, her thighs bracketing his hips, her breasts pressed against him. His hand was on her bare thigh, and he almost groaned with the effort it took to pull away from her. Dropping his forehead to hers, he closed his eyes and focused on the way she was breathing fast, the same as he was. Slowly, their inhales and exhales matched as they each began to calm down. God Almighty, he muttered under his breath. Don't blaspheme, she scolded in a whisper, and he had to smile. She was still giving him grief, even after that amazing, mind-blowing, earth-shattering kiss. Ditie. Clearing his throat, he straightened, but didn't pull away. Instead, he held her gaze. Ditie, my grandfather made a lot of money and started trust funds for me and my sisters. Do I strike you as a trust fund kinda guy? Don't answer that, and please forget you know my real name, okay? But yeah, I've got a fancy business degree, and it's been really useful in managing all my investments. Her eyes were still clouded from passion, but were slowly beginning to clear. She frowned, just slightly. You said something about investments that first day on the road. Yeah, he had. I live in the bunkhouse at the ranch. My truck is the most expensive thing I own, and honestly, that's all I need. I don't need all that money, but Pops gave it to me, so I keep messing with my investments and stocks, and it's growing. Yeah, I come from money, Ditie, but it's not me. She was still frowning. He sighed and dropped his forehead to hers. He wanted her. He wanted her badly, but if she wasn't going to accept him as he was, if she was going to continue obsessing over this weird image of him she obviously had in her head, then he wasn't so certain it was such a good idea. But man, oh man, that kiss. He wasn't ever going to be able to taste chocolate again and not think of her. But unable to resist temptation, he exhaled and brushed his lips against hers once more. This kiss was sweet and gentle and didn't reveal even a fraction of how much he was aching for her. Ditie, I think you ought to head back to your room now, before we both do something we're not sure about. The way her thighs tightened around his hips, just for a moment, before they relaxed again, told him she wasn't certain about her feelings at that moment either. And that was enough of a push for him to release her and step back. Not too far back, because he wasn't certain he could put much distance between them at that moment. But it was enough she could slide from the counter, her fingertips touching her upper lip which was red from his kisses, and squeeze around him. He was back to breathing heavily, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, to keep from reaching for her. It was hard, everything was hard, at that moment, but he didn't touch her. He didn't reach for her, didn't even speak to her. Instead, he watched her back away from him, confusion in her eyes now, and he wondered what she was thinking. Then the bedroom door shut behind her, and Rhodey stumbled backward as if he'd been held in place by some powerful force. With a groan, he dropped onto the couch and scrubbed his hands over his face. It was going to be a long night. Chapter 6. She thought it would be awkward to have to wake up the next morning, knowing they'd shared such a passionate kiss. But somehow, it wasn't. Somehow, it was lonely instead. Now that she'd kissed him, she missed him. I looked up how to make pancakes on my phone, she announced, as she stepped into the living room. He was still adorably groggy and looking more than a little hesitant as he eyed her. "You're making pancakes on your phone?" "No, silly, I looked up a recipe on my phone." She started pulling out pans and hoped he understood she was telling him she wasn't angry. How hard can it be? Turned out, it was pretty darn hard. But by the time breakfast was on the table, she'd only ruined half the pancakes. They were both laughing at her mistakes, and Rhodey had had to change shirts, thanks to her clumsiness. But it had been worth it. They slid into the dinette, both ignoring the picnic table outside their campsite. As he cut his pancakes, Rhodey's chocolate gaze flicked up to her. "I'm sorry I hurt you yesterday." Blushing, she was quick to assure him, "You didn't. I mean, it was great. Oh." His lips were twisted wryly. "Yeah, I meant before that, but, I mean, it's good to know, never mind. I'm sorry I hurt you before. I didn't mean to hide who I was." Embarrassed now, but determined to push through it, Ditie shook her head and kept her attention on her cup of orange juice. "What you said last night was right, it doesn't change who you are, not really. I had a preconceived notion about you, and I guess I was irritated it wasn't true." She forced a shrug. "It's not as if you lied to me." "I'm sorry I said you did." It took a long moment before she could work up the guts to peek up at him. She was a little ashamed of her outburst the previous night, especially after she had time to really consider his take on things. But she also couldn't regret the outburst, because it had led to. Well, that kiss had been one of the best things to ever happen to her. She'd stood in the Louvre, she'd waded in the Danube, she'd seen the northern lights in Lapland, and while those things had all been pretty cool, that kiss. She was afraid Rhodey might have ruined her for all other men. After last night, she knew she didn't want to kiss anyone else for as long as she lived. Oh dear, and now, he was smiling softly at her, as if he knew something she didn't. "So, truce? You forgive me for not being honest?" "No," she shook her head. "I'm saying there's nothing to forgive you for." His smile faded, and he paused, a piece of pancake on his fork. The look in his eyes turned speculative, then serious. "Are you sure?" She knew he was asking about the kiss specifically this time and wanted him to know there was nothing she regretted about that in particular. So she smiled and nodded and reached for her knife. "I'm positive." They continued west, toward Denver, but at her request, they didn't push themselves. They drove part of the day, then spent time looking at cool sights and visiting parks. Ditie took a lot of photos and wrote a bunch of blog posts about what she saw. She planned to edit them all once she was in Montana, and begin posting them again, bit by bit, in order to try to grow her readership once more. She'd been thinking a lot about what Rhodey had said about RV sponsors. She started following different RVing experts and influencers on different social media platforms and loved what she saw. If she could convince her readers she was back in the travel game, then maybe she could reach out to some RVing sites too. Besides, she was feeling more confident about the RV. She still wasn't the best chef, but that was nothing new. She could hook and unhook the rig all by herself now, although she still struggled with some of the compartments, because she was short. By their 5th day of the trip, she and Rhodey were working in sync, each in charge of an aspect of their little world, and it was nice. But there had been no more kissing, which was less nice. What the heck? She thought she'd made it pretty clear she wanted to kiss him again, and that she wasn't upset with him for the pleasure he'd brought her. But no matter how many times she put herself in place for another kiss, he didn't lean in and give her one. Which made her start to doubt, well, pretty much everything. Had she upset him? The thought had her frowning down at her laptop, her hands still on the keys, even though she wasn't really seeing what was on the screen. "Whatcha working on?" Rhodey asked, as he stepped out of the RV and joined her near the fire ring. Behind him, the mountains rose in the distance, and there was already a bite in the air. He slid into the picnic table bench across from her. "More blogging?" Embarrassed to have been caught pondering, she shook her head, then clicked through to the next email. "I've just been catching up on the charity work I do." He blinked, surprised. "You do charity work? I didn't know you were involved in that sort of stuff." Fair enough. There were things she hadn't told him about her life as well, she supposed, so maybe, just as she'd been irritated to discover she'd been wrong about him, maybe he had the right to be irritated at discovering new things about her? Was that why he hadn't kissed her again? She hesitated. I'm kinda on a board. A minor role really, and I haven't been doing as much in the last year since Aunt Gertie got sick. He propped his chin in his hand, and her gaze was drawn to the calluses on his fingertips. Oh man, but those hands had felt delicious against her bare skin. Sitting there at the picnic table was not the place to become aroused, but it was hard to forget how expertly he'd teased and stroked Anne. Tell me about it, he demanded. What? Oh. The charity. Right. Clearing her throat, she focused on the screen. It's a charity one of my childhood friends founded. When we were younger, my sisters and I used to go to this camp one of our family friends hosted. They have a ranch near Caudron Valley, the Calendar Ranch. Anyhow, they do these girls' camps in the summer and winter and used to run scholarships. One of their daughters has taken that scholarship program for the camp and expanded on it. In what way? He asked and seemed genuinely interested. It was hard to think when she was the center of his attention. It was a little hard to breathe too, and, was it getting warmer out here? Her voice caught, and she tried again. The Calendar Girls Camp now offers scholarships to attend the camps, but thanks to donors and an annual hot dog eating tournament we put on each spring, we can offer a lot of scholarships, and we then offer an essay contest for college, so girls who've attended the camps for more than 3 years can enter and apply, and we give small scholarships for their higher education. That's really cool. He straightened. An eating competition? That's a wild way to raise money. Tell me about it. Shyly, she explained that the competition had actually been her idea when she'd visited Japan a few years ago. She'd watched an eating competition, saw just how much fun it was for the spectators, and emailed June Calendar with the suggestion. Now the competition raised over half of what they needed for the year. For the last 5 years straight, we've grown. We've been able to offer more scholarships each year, which is the goal. Shaking his head, he pushed himself up from the table with a grin. That is so cool. The more I learn about you, Ditie Weston, the more you impress me. You want some marshmallows? Still flushing, the change of subject caught her by surprise. Why, yeah, of course I want marshmallows. Will you build a fire tonight? Sure, a small one. How do you choose scholarship recipients? And so Ditie spent the evening around the fire, chatting with Rhodey about the charity and her blogging, and somehow, he managed to hear all about her hopes for sponsorships. He didn't tease her though. In fact, he was certain she'd be able to build her blog audience into a bigger following so she could travel more. Thanks to your Aunt Gertie's legacy, you could, he assured her, waggling his marshmallow on a stick in her direction. And I think you'll be great at it. Plus, you can still manage the charity board stuff. His confidence in her made her smile shyly, and she scooted her chair a little closer to his. But he didn't try to kiss her. And he didn't try the next day either. By lunchtime, Ditie was getting desperate. Okay, not desperate for his kisses, exactly, but desperate to know what had happened, what had gone wrong. The two of them were laughing and teasing one another as if nothing had changed. She loved how empowered he made her feel and how supportive he was of everything. He was such a sweetheart, and now that she understood more about his background, he made sense, but then, he still managed to surprise her. Southbound reefer, brake check ahead. Rhodey's drawl into the CB radio surprised her, but more so when a gruff voice replied, 10-4, appreciate it, driver. She frowned as Rhodey put the radio back on the dash. What was that all about? He seemed surprised she'd been listening. Oh, did you see the backup going in the other direction? He nodded to the other side of the interstate. I was just warning that refrigerated truck so they could start slowing down. How did you get so good at trucker talk? He shrugged. I listen. It's called sandbagging when you're just listening to the radio, but after long enough doing that, it's easy enough to pick up on the meanings. Like, anytime they talk about bears, it's a highway patrol or trooper. There's all sorts of etiquette and whatnot. She settled back into her chair. And you just picked it up from listening and driving? Driving a chicken hauler, yeah. When he glanced at her and saw she didn't understand, he burst into chuckles. I mean, driving a truck which transports chicken. You were a truck driver? He shrugged. Sure. You know I love driving. There's just something about an open road that can't be beat. When he smiled, she had to join him. He was constantly surprising her. A business degree from WashU, and he was content to get his hands dirty, and travel. I feel the same way, she said softly. Whoops, he said suddenly, while flicking on the turn signal to change lanes. Getting out of the hammer lane for that dude. He slowed, and they both watched an SUV zipping in and out of traffic. More than a few trucks had to slow for the overeager driver. But Rhodey just smiled and shook his head. Man, why are you rushing? The journey's the best part, not the destination. Besides, the bait-and-switch isn't as effective with trucks and huge RVs. Ditie watched the faster SUV disappear ahead, where the storm clouds were thicker. The bait-and-switch? You know, the old snatch and grab. She frowned and turned back to him. What? The Queen Angela? The old badger meets two chipmunks? Are these trucking terms? I need a dictionary. Hold on and let me pull up a dictionary, she commanded, fumbling with her phone. I can't believe you haven't heard about Say Hello to Aunt Martha. The spaghetti sandwich? What? Ditie dropped her phone into her cavernous purse and narrowed her eyes at him. These cannot all be terms for the same thing. What do they mean? You don't know about the swish and flip? The sideways Sydney? How about stagecoaching? Going priest fishing? By this time, Rhodey couldn't hide his laughter anymore, and Ditie rolled her eyes. You're teasing me, aren't you? Maybe you should pull up that Trucker to English dictionary. Why, Rhodey? So it'll tell me he's making this shit up? What can I say? He snickered. Truckers are a funny bunch, and I had you going for a while there, huh? Ditie couldn't help but smile. Fine. Tell me some of the weirdest stuff you saw when you were driving chickens around, Mr. Trust Fund. So he told her all about the crazy nonsense he'd seen at truck stops and stories he'd heard over the CB, and she even learned about trucker bombs, the bottles of urine which sometimes were thrown out of windows if the driver's schedule was so tight he couldn't stop. She was laughing and cringing so hard, she had tears in her eyes, and as they rolled into their spot near the Bighorn National Forest in the pouring rain, she realized she hadn't been this happy in a long time. Maybe ever. No, discussing Trucker P wasn't what made her so happy. It was him. Rhodey may not have kissed her again, but he made her laugh. He made her feel good about herself, made her feel confident. He was teaching her all sorts of things, and she couldn't imagine anyone she'd rather be stuck in an RV with. Forever. Whoa, where had that thought come from? It's not wrong. Imagine how much fun you'd have, rolling around the country, with someone like Rhodey by your side. One perfect adventure. But she didn't want someone like Rhodey. She wanted Rhodey. That night, they didn't bother with the fire pit since it was still raining. Instead, she pulled up a classical station on her phone, even though he'd teased her about her newfangled gadgets, claiming the radio was good enough for him, and dragged out a puzzle. Now, she loved doing puzzles. One of the things she'd loved so much about the breeze was how much space the table had because it meant more puzzling. She loved the challenge and satisfaction of a well-executed puzzle. Rhodey, it turned out, did not. She was working on the cat in the puzzle. It was easy enough to just gather all the pieces with white fur, then work from the inside out. Any piece with only white fur got moved into this pile, and she worked to get those to connect, then moved outwardly to the pieces with white fur and something else, because that was the edge of the cat. Her sisters used to tell her that it was a weird way to do puzzles, but to her, it was super satisfying. Rhodey, on the other hand, was struggling with the edge pieces. The bottom edge was all black, and he had all the black edge pieces lined up in front of him. As near as she could tell, he was slapping them willy-nilly against each other. Her hands were on her pieces, but she watched him secretly from under lowered lashes. What was he doing? Any good puzzler knew the edges were the easiest part, and he should line the pieces up so all the edges were facing in the same. No, you can't connect those two together, neither is an edge piece. Eventually, she cleared her throat. It's probably easier if you just work on one part. Do you want to do the dog's face? Are you kidding? He frowned down at the pieces in front of him. I'm doing this bottom edge if it kills me. It might. If it doesn't kill me first. Okay, but just have it done before I finish the rest of the puzzle, okay, she quipped. With a scowl, he reached for another piece and haphazardly pushed it against the one he was holding. It clicked into place, and his whole face lit up. The smile he suddenly shot her was so perfect, it made her heart ache. I did it. Did you see that? I found a match. Without looking down, Ditie knew, by feel, that she'd connected 20 pieces in the time it took him to do that one. But it didn't matter. No, what mattered was his smile. And his pride. Good work. Now do another. He looked torn between pride and trepidation when he glanced down at his 2 pieces. Are you sure I can't just rest on my laurels a little longer? I'll finish the puzzle without you if you do. With a sigh, he slouched back against the dinette bench and twirled a black puzzle piece between his thumb and forefinger. She found herself mesmerized by the sight of those long fingers, remembering how they felt on her skin. To tell you the truth, sweetheart, I'm not much of a puzzler. At that endearment, Ditie jerked, her attention dropping to her pieces, trying to get her desire under control. Oh, really? She managed to say nonchalantly, perfectly aware he was a terrible puzzler. Maybe too nonchalantly. Yeah, but I'm sure you couldn't tell, he teased. Her lips twitched. You don't have to do the puzzle with me. Blowing out a breath, he leaned forward again and tried to fit the piece he was holding into another, entirely inappropriate, piece. I want to, he muttered. Staring at the top of his head, his brown hair falling over his forehead as he worked, Ditie realized something. He was doing this for her. He didn't love doing puzzles, but he knew she did. He was doing this puzzle, which he didn't enjoy, for her. And he called her sweetheart. But that wasn't all she realized. In that moment, Ditie knew an absolute truth, she was in love with this man. Her heart leapt, even as her brain reminded her he hadn't shown any interest in kissing her again. But he's doing a puzzle just because you wanted to do a puzzle. That didn't prove anything. He kissed you like you were a lifeline and he was drowning. But only once. You love him. Yes, she did. She loved Rhodey Fellows. Oh dear. Chapter 7. The very first thing Rhodey did the next morning was step outside the breeze, put his foot on a wet stone, and fall on his butt. No, actually, he fell on his right hand, trying to catch himself, and the snap and white-hot needle of pain which shot up his arm told him maybe he ought to have let his butt take the brunt of the fall after all. With a hiss, he rolled onto his knees, then his feet. He was still wearing his pajama pants, but now they were covered in mud from last night's rain. But that didn't matter so much, not when it felt as if his whole being was focused on the pain shooting up his right arm. He cradled the wrist to his chest and took deep breaths through his nose in an effort to calm the agony. It worked. After about a minute, it hurt less, and he was able to fumble for the RV door handle with his other hand and let himself back in. He didn't think the small freezer had any ice packs, but he figured he'd find something, and that was why, when Ditie came out of the bathroom a few minutes later, he was sitting at the dinette, with a pack of frozen corn draped over his wrist. Hey, she mumbled, rooting through the cabinet for her tea. You want breakfast? He wanted a pain pill, but was pretty certain he needed a doctor. He shook his head at her question, but she didn't see it. When she was finished making her tea, he hadn't had his coffee, but the way his blood was pumping right now, he didn't think he needed it. She turned around and propped her hip against the counter as she took her first sip. She was so darn adorable, first thing in the morning. And the fact that he could notice that, in the midst of all his pain, told him all he needed to know about his feelings for her. Breakfast? She asked again, one brow raising over the rim of her mug. I can try pancakes again. Her gaze dropped to the pack of corn. Unless you had something else in mind. You making salsa for breakfast? Who the hell puts corn in their salsa? Her other brow joined the first one, likely in response to his harsh tone. I put corn in my salsa, and black beans and lime juice and avocado and tomatoes and cilantro. That's not salsa, he growled, as he adjusted the cold pack and tried to swallow down the nausea roiling around in his stomach. That's a salad. She hummed, then shrugged. Okay. But it's a salad you can eat with tortilla chips, and that's the best kind of salad, as far as I'm concerned. She took another sip of her tea. But seriously, what's up with the corn? Breathing through his nose once more to control the pain, Rhodey eased the frozen corn away from his wrist. I fell outside. Before he had a chance to fully confess his idiocy, she slammed her tea down on the counter and flew across the space to him. He snapped his mouth shut when he realized her intentions, and was glad he did, because he would have definitely moaned when she slid into the dinette across from him and lifted his hand. Only, he wasn't certain if the moan would be from the pain, or from touching her. Damn it, not the time for that. He warned his libido. Besides, she was making enough noise for both of them, whimpering sympathetically, as she examined his wrist. When she bent it, he couldn't stop the hiss of pain. Well, okay then, she said, carefully placing it back on top of the frozen corn. I'm going to go get dressed, you don't move, and then you're going to tell me how to unhook my car from the tow. Thankful for the distraction, he asked, why? Because I'm taking you to the hospital to have that thing x-rayed. He shook his head. I'll be fine if we can just wrap it. We have to get you and this RV home. Placing her palms against the tabletop, Ditie held his gaze and leaned forward. I'm not in a hurry, and if you think I'm going to let you try to drive this RV with a possibly broken wrist, you're crazy. Your hands are. When she flushed and looked away, Rhodey's brows rose in surprise. Why was she embarrassed? My hands are what? They're important, she mumbled, her gaze locked on the table. You use them. A lot. Yeah. So does everyone else. They were hands. Hesitantly, it seemed, she reached out and brushed her fingertips against the top of his left hand. That appendage was whole and pain-free, and it took everything in his power not to flip his hand over and twine his fingers in hers. Your hands are special, she whispered. And then, without sparing him a glance, she darted into her bedroom. Following her instructions, he sat there at the table and concentrated on anything other than the pain in his wrist. She was back in moments it seemed like, and even in the current circumstances, she looked darn good. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and he didn't think she'd put on any makeup, but the way her curves filled out those shorts and that t-shirt, he thought she looked good enough to devour. Down, boy. It wasn't until she got closer that he realized she was carrying a long silk scarf. Come on. Stand up, she urged him. When he did, she very carefully took his hand and wrapped part of the blue material around his wrist, keeping it taut, but not too tight. Then she looped the extra silk around his neck, pulled it under his left arm, then tied it. There, she said proudly, stepping back to admire her work. That ought to keep you immobile for a little bit. At least until the doctors can tell if it's really broken. Ditie, we really don't need. Oh, yes we do, mister. I'm not letting you lose the use of one of those glorious hands, not on my watch. Lose the use of his hand? Over a simple break? Wait, she thinks my hands are glorious? In a bemused daze, although maybe that was thanks to the 2 over-the-counter pain pills she'd finally fed him with a sip of tea, or had it been enough time for them to have any effect yet, he followed her outside. The ground was still muddy and slippery, and they both stepped carefully toward the tow dolly. It was almost comical watching her try to unhook her car. She kept picking things up and moving them around, and it would have been so much simpler to do it himself, even with one hand. But this was her RV, and her car, and he was here to show her how to use both. So he held his patience as the pain slowly dulled to an aching throb and talked her through the steps needed to unhitch her car. And then he was sitting in the passenger's seat again, his knees tucked up against the glove box because he was so much taller than her tiny car, and she rambled away. He'd noticed that habit when she'd picked him up from the airport. When she was driving, she liked to talk. The topic at that moment was all about the various bones her brothers and sisters had broken over the years, but he wasn't certain she was actually listening to what she was saying, she just seemed to want to talk. So he closed his eyes, held his wrist against his chest, dropped his head back on the headrest, and just listened. They admitted him to the hospital without much trouble. The amusing part happened when they asked him for his ID and insurance card, and he realized he'd left it in the RV. No, I grabbed it, an excited Ditie declared, plopping her cavernous purse on the intake lady's desk. She mumbled to herself as she pulled out various things and plopped them on the desktop. A corn-on-the-cob holder. 4.5 feet of pharmacy receipt. A snow globe. A half-squeezed tube of toothpaste. A pair of scissors. A whisk. And finally, his wallet. Chuckling, he took it from her and found the right cards to hand over, then made a great ceremony out of dropping his wallet back in her purse. He even put his hand up to his ear, as if waiting for the sound of it hitting bottom. Ditie peered curiously inside, as if something might have changed in there, and the intake lady giggled. Then they were both sitting in a chilly room in the back, waiting for the nurse to come x-ray his arm. They waited in silence, but after about a minute, Ditie reached over and hesitantly took his left hand in hers. And that made the whole damn experience worth it, as far as he was concerned. It turned out the wrist was broken, but it wasn't a bad break. The doctor seemed confident Rhodey could take the brace off in a few weeks, depending of course on what the doctor back home said. Rhodey didn't think it was a big deal, but he loved the way Ditie listened intently and took notes on her phone. The idea of her taking care of him sent a warmth through him. Or maybe that was just the pain meds. By the time they got out of there, both of them were starved, since they'd missed breakfast. After we pick up your prescription pain meds, I'm stopping for some burgers for lunch, she announced, after she'd helped him buckle his seatbelt, to hold off the grungries. The what? Like, grumpy and hungry. He shook his head, bemused. I've heard of being so hungry you're angry. Hangry, yes. But this is one step below that. Grumpy, not angry, she explained, as she eased onto the main road. So wouldn't that be? He squinted ahead, trying to work out the logistics of squishing together two words. Well, I guess it can't be hungry, although the vowels would be correct. Hungry, maybe? Hungry, she repeated in a thoughtful tone, then shrugged. Okay, yeah. I like it. I'm getting hungry, and to stave off the hangries, I'm stopping for lunch. He had to grin at her silliness. Sounds good to me. They picked up burgers and fries and chocolate shakes. For stamina, she declared, nodding her head firmly as she passed him the shakes. He took them from her with his left hand and placed them in the cup holders. Plus, it's impossible to be grumpy with a chocolate shake. Since she had a mouthful of fries as she pulled back into traffic, she just grunted in agreement. On the way back into the campground, they stopped to arrange an extra night's reservation, since it was clear they weren't going anywhere anytime soon. At the site, they didn't bother hooking her car back up to the RV just yet, as rain was threatening again, so they hustled inside to change into dry, mud-free clothes and enjoy their able-to-be-eaten one-handed lunch. After lunch, with the rain dripping down the window panes, Ditie fed him one of his stronger pain pills, and they both plopped on the couch to watch movies and make a sizable dent in their road trip snacks. At some point, Rhodey fell asleep. It might have been because of the pills, or his full stomach, or the fact he hadn't been sleeping well on the couch, but one minute he was watching Legolas reveal Aragorn's true identity to Boromir, and the next, he was waking up with his head pillowed on Ditie's shoulder. When he opened his eyes, it was to see her profile as she peered down at her laptop. She looked so damn peaceful and perfect, and he didn't want to disturb her. But she must have noticed he was awake, because she tilted her head slightly to the side, the smooth skin of her cheek pulling upward as she smiled softly. "Hi," she said quietly. And in that moment, Rhodey wanted nothing more than this. This peace and contentment. He wanted this for the rest of his life. But she was his employer, and he'd already vowed not to make any more advances, and not to take anything more than he'd already taken. That would make it easier to say goodbye in a few days. Besides, it's probably just the pain pills. But he was pretty sure it wasn't. The rest of the afternoon was more movie watching and snacking, and dinner ended up being popcorn and cheese and crackers as the rain came down. It was really nice snuggling up with her like that, and it was almost worth breaking his wrist for. But then came bedtime. "Rhodey, I don't think you should sleep on the couch." Well, that got his attention. His head swung up to find her frowning down at him from her spot by the dinette. "What do you mean?" Her arms were folded in front of her chest, and she wore a sweatshirt from Paris, which matched her fuzzy socks. "That couch has always been too small for you. If you sleep there tonight, you're going to be lying on your hurt arm." Slowly, he stood up. "I can just switch sides, put my head at the other end of the couch, so I'm lying on my left side," but she shook her head, and it looked as though she was chewing on her lower lip. Damn, but he wanted to pull her into his arms, okay, arm, and taste that lip again. But he held back, because he'd already hurt her once, and he damn sure didn't want to hurt her again. Finally, she blew out a frustrated breath. "Sorry, Rhodey, but I'm going to have to be firm about this. You need a real bed. I want you to switch with me. You take the bed tonight." His brows rose, and his lip curled wryly as he shook his own head. "Look, Ditie," he said, lowering his chin and his voice, "as much as I like the idea of being able to stretch out in a real bed, I'm not going to kick you out of yours. That's your bed, sweetheart." When she took a step toward him, he noticed her breathing was more rapid than normal, and the little pulse at the base of her throat was fluttering. That spot of skin was visible because she hadn't laced up her sweatshirt, and he couldn't seem to take his eyes off it. Until she said, "Okay," in a hesitant voice, and he looked up to see her lick her lower lip. "Okay," she repeated, "so we'll share it." You want to share a bed with me?" Something flashed in her eyes, excitement, longing, maybe desire, but she hid it with a smile. "I don't want to sleep on the couch any more than you do." Her grin turned teasing. "But no funny business." He met her warning with a teasing smile of his own. "As if I could even think about doing anything funny when I'm in this much pain." "I'm sorry." Immediately her expression softened, and she reached for his arm, stopping only when her fingertips hovered over his brace, as if afraid to touch him. "Do you need more pills? Are you really in that much pain?" Holding her gaze, he lifted his brace until it caught her hand, and the comforting weight of her touch sent warmth up his arm. Holding her gaze, he murmured, "Not anymore," and was rewarded with a shy blush from her. But then she turned away, and he followed, working together to prepare for the evening. It was awkward trying to brush his teeth with his left hand, and her hovering wasn't as helpful as she might have thought. But it made him feel good, and obviously her too, which is what mattered. He managed to handle everything else himself, and soon he was standing in the bedroom, facing her across a pillow-filled bed. "Do you think there'll be enough room?" she asked, eyeing the pillows and chewing on her lower lip. "Sure. We just need to get rid of some of these pillows." Her gaze snapped up to his. "Get rid of my pillows? Are you nuts?" He shrugged. "Aren't they decorative?" "They're functional." She blew out a breath, then reached for a pillow. "Okay, if you're sleeping on that side, then let me see," she began muttering to herself. "This one will become heady, and this one is heady number 2. I guess you could use this one, he's one of my backups." "How many pillows do you need?" she asked Rhodey, glancing up. "One is fine, thanks." He stared at her in disbelief and wondered if he shouldn't lay off the pain meds completely. "One," she scoffed, then shook her head. "Okay, you get that one, I've got these two." There was still a half-dozen left on the bed. "And the rest can go on the floor?" he cautiously asked. She looked aghast at him. "Are you crazy?" "No. This one is facey." "What?" "Facey. He goes on my face. Well, actually he goes on my head and ear, because I'm a side sleeper, but I've already got 2 headies, and I didn't think Eerie was a good name. Sounds too much like eerie, you know, like spooky?" Rhodey wiped his feet on the small rug and sat down on the edge of the bed, one knee pulled up so he could face her. Let me get this straight. You name your pillows? No, that would be weird. I give my pillows jobs, see? These two are for my head, that one's for my face. This one is Huggy, I'm a side sleeper, remember, and this one is usually Backy. Backy, he repeated blandly. Because he goes against my back, she explained in a slow, loud manner, as if he was having trouble understanding. When I roll over, he becomes my Huggy. Pillow rolls change, see, depending on how I'm sleeping. He was having trouble containing his laughter, but it was clear she was serious about all this. With me in the bed, there might not be enough room for Backy, he managed. Good point. Humming, she studied the bed. Okay, this one can become crotchy, and I'll make do without a Backy tonight, since I don't want to squash you. With a sigh, she gathered the rest of the pillows in her arms. I'll move these to the couch. His laughter was ready to burst out. I'm sorry, did you just call that one crotchy? I need a pillow between my knees, Rhodey, she called over her shoulder with a little roll of her eyes. Of course, he muttered, lying back against his one pillow. And knee is too strange a name, but not crotchy? She came back in. Did you say something? Nope. Pulling the covers over himself, he smiled and closed his eyes. Thanks for compromising on the pillows. The light flicked off and the bed dipped as she climbed in. He heard her whisper, thanks for compromising on the bed. He wanted to say, no, thank you, but he didn't bother. He was too busy enjoying how damn right it felt to have her lying next to him. He took a deep breath and moved his left arm, just slightly, until it was brushing against her back. And he smiled. Good night, Ditie, he said with a yawn. He was almost asleep when he heard her answering whisper, good night, Rhodey. Chapter 8. It took Ditie a while to wake up. Okay, it always took her a while to wake up, what with the pillows and the mattress topper and how absolutely scrummy it felt under all these blankets. Also, was anyone truly awake before morning tea? But this morning, it was because of the hand. There was a hand on her hip. It took her a little while to identify it, and when she did, she went positively gooey. It was his hand, wasn't it? And the fact she knew, logically, it was encased in a brace, and he'd probably just rested it there because he'd needed some way to support it, in the absence of a sensible number of pillows, didn't make it any less wonderful. That, and her back was pressed against his front, and his hardness was enough to make her shiver. Good thing you're both fully dressed. She snorted quietly at her subconscious and reminded herself the poor man was probably in terrible pain. And no, you aching to kiss him again isn't equitable, young lady. That was a different kind of pain. Still, it was absolutely amazing to wake up in his arms, or at least, with one of his hands on her, injured or not, and that was probably why she decided right then and there they needed to stay in their damp little campsite one more night. When she told him, as he sat at the table and she made breakfast, he argued, but not too hard, and then agreed after she explained how muddy it was, and how she didn't have much interest dealing with the hookups on her own in the steady drizzle. Besides, she added, as she slid a plate of the promised pancakes from the previous day in front of him, I'm the one in charge of the schedule, right? Do you have a pressing need to get home soon? No, ma'am, he drawled in that sexy cowboy voice of his, and she swallowed down her longing with her orange juice. The day was spent much the same as the afternoon before, except this time, he didn't fall asleep on her, to her slight disappointment. There'd been something really comforting from listening to his breathing as he snoozed against her shoulder. It meant he trusted her. They tried another puzzle, since she'd finished the one from the other night, without much help from him. It was hilarious trying to explain to him the correct method of hunting down the right pieces. That red's too dark. Look. Look at the colors. He frowned down at the piece he was holding in his good hand, the brace resting on the table alongside the window. This is red. I'm doing the berries, right? Sighing, she reached out and plucked 2 red pieces from the pile. Look, these are the right reds, see how bright they are? You've got a dark red, so it's from the shadowy side of the berries, or up here around the butterflies. He squinted at her pieces, then at his own. I think the lighting's bad in here or something. They look the same to me. I think it has to do with our evolutionary traits. When we were cavemen, cavewomen, in my case, you'd have had to have been good at hunting and running and lifting rocks and stuff like that. I would have had to be good at differentiating what kind of plants were good to eat, versus the poisonous ones. What does that have to do with puzzles? She tapped the picture of the berries on the box. My sister Lainey is always reading, and she told me that sometimes the differences in color between edible berries and poisonous berries is just a few shades. So cavewomen had to know which shade of red or purple or whatever was okay to eat. And the ones who couldn't tell were poisoned. His lips twitched. And thus, didn't reproduce, so their lack of color differentiation died with them? She nodded firmly. And the cavemen who didn't get good at throwing rocks or spears at lions' heads, then running away very quickly, didn't make it either. Smiling, he dropped the piece and propped his chin in his palm. I think I'd like to attend more of your anthropology lectures, Professor Weston. She scowled, but only to cover the blush she knew his teasing had caused. Under the table, one of his bare feet had brushed against her fuzzy sock. And he hadn't moved it. Maybe that's why she was blushing. The rest of the day was equally low-key, movies, puzzles, snacks, and it turned out he was terrible at Jenga. But they decided the campsite wasn't completely level, and therefore, it wasn't really his fault. Rhodey seemed in less pain, but he wasn't using his hand. That afternoon, the rain finally cleared, and Ditie had to admit their time in the campsite was coming to an end. So before bed, she braced herself for what had to be said. I know we can make it home in one day, if we needed to, but since it'll be my first time driving, I'd like to do it in 2 days, if you're okay with coaching me through it. His eyes widened, and then he winced. When she asked about it, he shook his head and leaned down to pull back the covers. It honestly never occurred to me that I wouldn't be able to drive this rig with a busted wrist. I'm sorry, Ditie. Do you? When he trailed off, but didn't meet her eyes, she prompted him, do I what? Do you want me to find someone who can drive you? I can make it home on my own, no problem, but... She interrupted before he said anything more foolish. Absolutely not. Taking a deep breath, she made herself calm down. You've been teaching me how to handle the RV by myself, well, now it's just a test, really. I get to practice in real life. We started this adventure together, and we're going to finish it together. His gaze was serious, as if wondering if she were telling the truth. But then it dropped to her lips, and he looked away. Together, he whispered, and climbed into bed beside her. She didn't talk while she was driving. That's how he knew how nervous she was. Frankly, he was nervous too, and possibly, for the same reasons. He'd always preferred to be the one in the driver's seat. It was nerve-wracking to be a passenger in his opinion. But to know she'd never before driven anything bigger than a pickup, and she was over there stiff as a board and terrified out of her mind, certainly didn't make him feel any better. But he did his best to reassure her. That's right. That's it. Just watch your mirrors, sweetheart, he murmured, trying to look in 3 places at once. She was doing the same thing, her nervous gaze darting between the road ahead, the side mirror, and instinctively glancing up to where the rear view would be in a car. Her knuckles were white around the steering wheel, and her breaths were coming fast. You've got this, sweetheart. Just ease onto the ramp, yeah. Now pick up speed. They both relaxed when she was on the highway. It was almost funny the way she blew out a breath and slumped back in the chair, despite the white-knuckled grip she continued to maintain. And he noticed she stayed a consistent 10 miles below the speed limit. Well, she's driving a rig and pulling a tow for the first time. Besides, the slower she went, the longer he got to spend with her. And Lord have mercy, but he didn't think he'd ever forget waking up with her in his arms again this morning. He'd been rock hard and aching for her, but he'd known he couldn't do anything about it. Somehow during the night, she'd rolled over into his arms, and they'd woken up wrapped around one another. And it had felt perfect. Despite the whole sexual frustration thing. Part of him wanted this road trip to last forever. He wanted to spend the rest of his life the way he was right now, eating junk food, teasing her, laughing over stupid things, and waking up with her in his arms. He'd even take the broken wrist along with it. But the other part of him knew he wouldn't be able to last much longer without kissing her, without making her his. It was pure torture not to take advantage of her again, not to reach for her, not to taste her. He knew he couldn't continue this way. So he spent the day conflicted, and the next day as well. Another night sleeping beside her, feeling her warmth, smelling her sweetness. The fact he hadn't been able to shower didn't seem to matter, they were perfect together. And he had to pull himself back from kissing her so often. They were nearly to Caudron Valley. She'd decided to drop him off at the ranch since his buddy Rusty had driven him to the airport, when she glanced over at him. She was looking much more relaxed today, and he was glad she'd made the call to take this last leg in 2 days. "Hey," she said softly, and he offered her a little grin. She swallowed, then turned back to watch the road. I just wanted to say thank you for falling on my butt and making you drag my useless carcass across 2 states?" A hint of a smile flitted across her face. "For teaching me so much. You didn't have to do that. I hired you to drive me, and I figured that would be it. But you took the time to make sure I could handle this thing on my own, and I just wanted you to know how much I appreciate it." He shifted in his seat, her appreciation making him feel awkward. "Of course, Ditie. It was really cool to hang out with you. This is your RV, and it makes sense for you to understand how to drive it, so you don't have to hire anyone else to do it for you." The words hung unspoken between them. He wanted to be the one to drive her around, but he wanted it to be her choice. "Well, thank you. Maybe I will take that adventure I've been thinking about." He hoped she did. But that didn't mean he wanted her to go without him. So when it was time to drop him off, it took everything in Rhodey's power to get up out of that passenger seat and head back to where he'd already packed his duffel. The pillow he'd used when he slept on the couch was still there, and the reminder of her little pillow obsession made him smile. "Your check's in the duffel." Her announcement made him frown as he turned back to her. She nodded to the duffel in his left hand. "I put the check for the amount I owe you in there. In an envelope in the outer pocket." Thank you." He had no intention of cashing it. He didn't need it, and it would be a memory to hold on to. It took a moment to realize he was holding his breath, and watching her, waiting for her to say something, anything, to cause him to stay. But she didn't. He'd done what he'd said he'd do. He'd gotten her and her Tiffin breeze across country. He'd gotten her home, even if all that really meant was teaching her how to take herself home. He swallowed and dropped his chin in acceptance. He'd done what he needed to do and would have the memory of that one perfect kiss to get him through the coming weeks, or however long it took him to get over her. Months. Years. Forever. Because he didn't think he'd ever forget Ditie Weston, even though it was clear she was done with him. "Goodbye, Ditie," he managed, just as he pushed the door open with his boot. If she said anything in return, he didn't hear it. Once outside, he dropped his duffel in the dust and turned to frown at the breeze. After the first minute, he began to get nervous, wondering what was taking her so long. Was she okay? Could she remember how to get it out of park? Was there an issue with the key? Was she sitting in the driver's seat, crying? Does she just not want to leave me? But finally the big RV rumbled to life, and she inched it out of the parking lot. He was so damn proud of how she remembered to make the turn wide, and how smoothly she accelerated. "I taught her that. And that would have to be enough." Standing there in the dust of the parking lot, Rhodey pushed his hat back on his head and tilted his head back to squint toward the sun. So he could pretend the bright rays were the reason why there were tears in his eyes. Chapter 9. It had been over a year since Ditie had seen her family. Aunt Gertie had called her last spring, and they'd started making plans. By Thanksgiving, even though Ditie had already bought tickets back to Montana, her aunt was just too weak to live alone, and she'd had no one else to rely on. Ditie hadn't been willing to hire a complete stranger to come sit with her great-aunt while she went back home to visit, so the result was this was her first time seeing her parents and siblings since she'd left, and the first thing she did when her mother had opened her arms and squealed, "Aphrodite's home," was burst into tears. Luckily, Mom didn't think anything of it. In fact, she started crying too. She probably assumed Ditie was just so overwhelmed with joy, she couldn't contain herself. And yes, okay, that was part of it. Ditie really was glad to see her family in person, to be able to hug them, but that wasn't what caused this horrible emptiness in her chest and stomach. Nope. That was all Rhodey. Rhodey, and the way he'd picked up his duffel and walked out of her life like he had no reason to stay. Rhodey, who'd taken her check and thanked her and hadn't kissed her again and whom she missed, damn it. And her family thought she was just crying in happiness. Mom eventually let go of her long enough to start cooking dinner. The Westons had all been made aware that they were expected at the ranch to celebrate, and the evening proved to be overwhelming. Not only were all her siblings there, but her new brothers-in-law too. She barely remembered Wyatt Caudron from when her oldest brother Jax had been best friends with him, but it was good to see how happy he and Artie were. Likewise, Arya and Seth Maestro, who had the most divine voice she could imagine, and Athena and Hunky Aaron. And when Lainey finally showed up with her new husband Blake, Ditie was able to cuddle their sweet little baby Blossom, whom they'd both officially adopted. It was great to see them, and Ditie did her best to push her sad thoughts aside. She wanted her smiles to be genuine when she was finally seeing her family again. She was pretty sure she'd managed it too, until her twin brother stepped up beside her in the kitchen. There was a momentary lull, as most of the crowd had joined Dad outside at the grill, and Don caught Ditie by surprise. "What's wrong?" he asked in a low voice, holding his can in front of his lips, presumably so no one would overhear. Adonis was her twin, and even though they didn't have a lot in common, and even though she'd been away from him for long periods before, like when she traveled, he always seemed to be able to read her better than anyone else in her family. Still, she really didn't want to get into things tonight, so she just smiled brightly, and said, "Nothing's wrong. I'm glad to be home." And Dawn just hummed and muttered, as she hurried outside to hang out with Dad and the rest of her family. Somehow, she made it through the evening, and after everyone left, Mom led her back to her old bedroom. Ditie had moved from home to college to home to Charleston, with plenty of trips in between. So the room she'd once shared with her older sisters didn't really feel like home anymore. Besides, as her siblings had all moved out, Mom had redecorated the large rooms into guest rooms, and was even talking about starting a bed and breakfast once Aries, the youngest, moved out. "Thanks, Mom," Ditie said, stopping at the doorway. "But I think for now, I'd rather stay in the RV. All my stuff's out there." And it was more than just her stuff. Her whole life was packed into the breeze right now. That was her bed with her pillows. Why would she want to stay in a guest room, when her own home was right out in the driveway? "Of course, honey. I understand." But after 3 days of living in her parents' driveway, she still didn't feel at home. Or at ease. Her sisters had called her up and dragged her out for meals and shopping trips, but she'd declined all their invitations to go to Caudron Ranch, despite so many of them living there now. Artie had nonchalantly asked, "How was the trip? Did Rhodey work out okay?" And Ditie had been forced to plaster on another smile. "Sure," she said brightly. "He taught me how to drive the RV and the trip was amazing." Then she launched into the description of the Smoky Mountains. She'd already published that installment on her blog and was getting great interaction, and the stories she told helped to distract her sister. But then Arya mentioned Rhodey seemed sad lately. Apparently, they had a sort of rotating game night on the ranch, and Ditie got worried. She was worried about Rhodey, worried he might be sick or something. Which is stupid, because he was probably just happy to be home. Why should I worry over him, when he'd made it clear he didn't want me to be a part of his life? The fourth morning after she got home, there was a knock on the door of the Breeze, just as she was rooting around for her tea bags. Before she could call out an invitation, her twin brother pulled open the door and stepped inside with 2 tall travel mugs. "I stopped by my favorite coffee shop and grabbed you a chai tea latte." He waggled it in offering, and she lunged for it. "Oh my gosh, you're a lifesaver, Dawn." Her twin was used to getting up at ridiculous o'clock in the morning, thanks to years spent coaching the same high school football team most of her brothers had played on. That probably explained why he was already out and about and picking up delicious treats at this hour. So, he drawled, sliding into the dinette and propping his feet up on the opposite bench. You going to tell me what's wrong now? Please, come in and make yourself comfortable, she muttered drily. Thanks, I will. He smirked. So what's up? You've been miserable since you got home, but when we talked while you were on the road, you seemed so energized. Like you were doing what you wanted to be doing. Are you upset because you're back home now? That was as good an excuse as any, so Ditie grabbed it. Yes. Yes, I really love RVing, and now that Aunt Gertie has left me this RV, and some money to live on, although she didn't bother saying that, I think I can make it work. Dawn was peering a little more intently at her than she liked as he took a sip of his coffee. She sank down on the couch opposite him and tried for a smile. Finally, he shook his head. No, I don't think that's it. You were too enthusiastic right there. Remember, I'm the one who gave you pointers on how to lie. She gasped. You did not. Well, he shrugged. I taught you to play poker. Same difference. She slumped back. And you always knew when I was bluffing. Yep, like now. I think this has something to do with that guy who was driving you. The one Wyatt and Blake and Seth and Aaron vouched for. What was his name? Rhodes? Rhododendron. But she wasn't going to tell her brother that. So she just mumbled, Rhodey Fellows. Dawn hummed. What did he do? You want me to go beat him up? Pretty sure me and Pole and Jax can take him. That had her lips twitching a bit, just knowing Dawn cared, and she took a sip of her tea to hide her reaction. Come on, Ditie, he cajoled. You might as well tell me. I'm not going anywhere. So she did. She told her twin brother about how excited she'd been to start her adventure, but how somehow, just being with Rhodey had become the adventure. She told him how Rhodey had taught her so much and had seemed genuinely interested in her life. She told him how Rhodey's family had left him so much money, but he lived simply, spending money on others instead of himself. She told him about the broken wrist and their cozy little interlude in Wyoming. She even told him how Rhodey had kissed her. Don nodded, saluting her with his coffee. And somewhere between Nashville and home, you fell in love with him? Yeah, she sighed, staring down at the mug she gripped in both hands. I did. I do, love him. It's going to be hard to get over this feeling, let me tell you. Do you have to? Get over it, her gaze flicked up to frown at him. Yeah. I don't particularly want to spend the rest of my life feeling sad because my heart got broken. Her brother's grin flashed. I meant, are you certain he doesn't feel the same way that you feel? Scoffing, she took another sip of her tea. Pretty much. He kissed me, Dawn. He kissed me, and, arg. She made an inarticulate noise as she flopped her head back. He didn't kiss me again, she whispered, staring up at the ceiling. No matter how incredible it was, no matter how much I wanted it, he clearly didn't. Are you sure? With a growl, she lifted her head to glare at him. If he did, he would have done it again. But Dawn just shrugged and slid to the end of the bench. Look, all I'm saying is that everything I've heard about him seems to make him sound like a good, honorable guy. The two of you obviously really enjoyed each other's company. Standing, he towered over her, but he wasn't done lecturing. Rhodey could be avoiding you because he doesn't want to see you again, yeah. Or he might really like you, that kiss sure sounds as if he does, but he's just not sure how you feel. Think about it from his point of view, you were his employer, and maybe he felt like being stuck in an RV together was taking advantage of you. Or maybe he was waiting for you to make a move on him. Mouth agape, Ditie shot to her feet. You think I should have, what? Thrown myself at him? Her twin shrugged and finished off the last of his coffee. Then, with a grin, he patted her on the shoulder. You could try it. It might work. Throw herself at him. She remembered how she'd been the one to grab Rhodey, to pull him in for a kiss, before he'd taken over. Was her brother right? Was Rhodey just being honorable? He'd waited for her to make a move before kissing her, and then, since she hadn't made any further moves, was that why he hadn't kissed her again? With a groan, Ditie pinched the bridge of her nose. Could it really be something so simple? Throw herself at him. It might work. He's a mechanic, right? Dawn's voice cut through her frantic contemplation. And he's familiar with this vehicle, right? Isn't there something that needs work? That'd give you an excuse at least. She frowned at her brother. How'd you get so good at relationship stuff? I've never seen you with a girlfriend, and you're always grumping around about women. Not women in general, just one of them, he muttered. Ditie studied her twin, suddenly remembering the way he and their sister Athena's best friend Minnie could never be in the same room together without one of them snapping at the other. There's something going on there. Either the pair were mortal enemies, as they appeared, or there was another reason entirely behind Dawn and Minnie's spats. So look, you want me to break something in here? Dawn glanced around the interior of the RV, probably safer to bust the interior, rather than, like, the engine. You need to be able to get the thing to Caudron Ranch, right? So. When he placed the empty travel mug on the counter and began to crack his knuckles, Ditie lunged for him and grabbed his arm. Laughing, she shook her head. One of the drawer sticks. It's usable, but a pain. Is that good enough? Dawn actually looked disappointed he wouldn't get the chance to destroy something. Well, okay. Not nearly as much fun as yanking the faucet off the sink, but I guess sticking drawers will work. She gave him a grateful hug. Thanks, Dawn, she whispered against his shoulder, as he gathered her in his arms. This might just work. Maybe. Her twin patted her on the back, and when she straightened, he smiled. Get out there, sis, and make a move on your man. Rhodey ducked out the back door of the big house where the Caudron family had lived for generations. Ted Caudron, his boss, kept his office there, and Rhodey had just had a meeting he'd never expected to have. Where are you running off to, young man? A voice called after him. He turned and forced a smile for Griselda, the Caudron's housekeeper. Just heading back to the bunkhouse, ma'am. He had to finish packing after all. Well, take one of my cupcakes, dear. It's a new flavor I'm trying out. She waved a white frosted cupcake in his direction, so without any other choice, he took it and bit into it. His eyes lit. He managed around a mouthful. This is good. Raspberry mint, she declared proudly. Not a usual combination in baked goods, but I think it'll go over well. Rhodey remembered Rusty's wedding, when Griselda had handed him a cupcake with red frosting, which she'd said was special. That one had been good, but this flavor. Miss Griselda, this is amazing. That's good to know, dear, she said, with a wink and a shooing motion. I'll make up a batch for your wedding. Now go. His wedding? Well, no one could deny she was a strange one. He stumbled down the back steps, popped the last of the treat in his mouth, and headed for the bunkhouse. Wedding. He had to admit, he'd been thinking a lot about that sort of thing over the last few days. Ever since he'd said goodbye to Ditie, and his world felt as if it were collapsing. It wasn't until yesterday, when his friend Alcatraz had finally offered him some advice, that he'd begun to have some hope. Maybe she's as miserable as you are, the petite cowgirl had suggested. Maybe she just didn't invite you in for a kiss, because she was waiting on you to make a move. Rhodey had frowned. She was my boss, and I didn't want to make it awkward if she wasn't interested. Alcatraz had thrown up her hands and muttered Erie's tan patetico, que resultas entrainable. Then she shook her head. My point is, she declared, shoving one finger dangerously close to his nose, is that you won't know unless you ask her. Maybe she wants you to join her on one of her trips. Maybe she's madly in love with you. Maybe she hates your guts, and you're going to have to spend the next 20 years here at the ranch seeing her sisters every time you visit your friends. You don't know. Rhodey had been up most of the night thinking about that. Well, thinking and packing, once he'd come to a decision. He didn't have much to pack, but it kept his hands occupied. He was going to talk to her, and if she said, "No, I never want to see you again," then he was going to pack up and leave anyhow. Because Alcatraz was right, he couldn't spend the next 20 years seeing her sisters, and maybe even her, and if it meant leaving his friends and the life he'd made for himself here behind, maybe it would be worth it. Maybe. Luckily, Ted Caudron had agreed to his proposition, and now it was up to Rhodey to make it happen. He had to head back to his room to grab his wallet and keys, to hell with what the doctor had said about not driving, and then he was going to be making a beeline for the Weston ranch. He was so intent on his mission, he almost missed the huge breeze parked in front of the bunkhouse. Ditie? Ditie. He wanted to call her name, but didn't dare. Instead, he shot toward the big RV, his heart in his throat, as he banged on the door. Long moments passed as his heart hammered against his ribs, and he studied the vehicle, making sure it was the right one. "How many breezes are there in Caudron Valley, idiot?" There was no answer, and when he accepted that, his heart sped up even more. He knocked again, then pulled the door open and stuck his head inside. Ditie? There was no one inside. Had she come to see him? He slammed the door, then whirled and jogged for his room. She had no idea where he lived, but the bunkhouse wasn't that big, and his room wasn't locked. But why would she have come anyhow? Why would she? When he reached his room, he skidded to a stop and nearly stumbled when he realized she was there. When she heard him, she twisted around, and her instant smile made his chest relax for the first time since he'd seen the RV parked outside. Ditie, he breathed her name again. Her gaze dropped to his hands. His hands, or his wrist brace? He wasn't certain. "How are you?" she blurted, her eyes moving up to find his again. "Are you feeling okay?" Was checking on him the only reason she'd come? Was she feeling some sort of responsibility or misplaced guilt over his injury? "I'm fine." He shook his head, then nodded, unsure if he should hope as he stepped into the room. "The doctor says the wrist is healing fine, and I probably won't have to wear this too much longer." "And how are you doing, with work and stuff?" Well, this was awkward, wasn't it? With a shrug, he pulled his hat from his head. "Less fine, since I'm not supposed to be driving, but it's impossible not to drive on a ranch this size. I'm definitely taking it easy though." "Oh." She hesitated, then took a step forward. You're probably wondering why I'm here." He eyed her, wondering how she'd react if he swept her up into his arms. Or at least one arm, but he just hummed in agreement. "The kitchen drawer," she blurted, staring over his shoulder. "It's still sticking. I didn't know if I should take it to a mechanic, or a carpenter, or if you knew someone." That was why she was here. Rhodey clenched his fingers around the brim of his hat. Sure. Yeah, I can take a look at it." "Okay. Good. Okay." She took a deep breath, started to step around him, then stopped. "Why is all your stuff in boxes?" He couldn't answer that, not yet. So he took a step toward her. "Did you really come here just because you needed someone to fix a drawer in the RV?" Hope and fear both flickered within her ice-blue gaze, and she seemed to be holding her breath. "No," she whimpered, as she took a step toward him. "Then why are you here, Ditie?" he murmured. She stared, her eyes wide, for a long moment. Suddenly, she sucked in a breath and straightened her shoulders. "I came to give you something, Rhodey Fellows." Well, she'd already paid him, so what else could she possibly want to give him? "What is it?" "This." And with that, she reached out and grabbed the lapels of his blue shirt, yanking him closer. She pushed herself up on her toes and pulled him down, and then her mouth was on his, and he quit wondering. Yes. Yes. His heart and his libido were pumping together now, and it didn't matter at all, because Ditie was finally in his arms again. He snaked his right hand with the brace around her back, to support her, and cupped her cheek with his good hand. When had he dropped his hat? Lord help him, but she felt good. No, she felt perfect. Her arms were around his shoulders now, tugging and pulling and demanding, and she was making those sexy little whimpers in the back of her throat, and Rhodey didn't think he could ever get enough of her. But one of them had to have some sense. "Ditie," he gasped, pulling away from her. He was perversely pleased to see her breathing as hard as he was. "If you think you're going to apologize, mister, you can just shut your mouth," she snapped at him, pushing away. "I wasn't going to apologize," he muttered, his gaze still on her lips. "Good." She nodded firmly. "Because I made the move here, and I should be the one to apologize." Warily, he dragged his gaze back up to hers. "Are you going to? Do I need to?" He blew out a breath and dragged his hand through his hair as he stepped away from her. "Ditie, I packed because I was coming to see you." "I wanted to ask, why was this so hard to say?" He squeezed his eyes shut so he wouldn't see her reaction. "I wanted to know if there's any chance you feel the same way about me, that I feel about you." She was silent for long enough. He actually peeked one eye open to see if she was still there. She stood in the center of his room, her hands on her hips, smiling at him. "Are you asking me if I love you, Rhodey?" And his heart started double timing again. "Because I do." She nodded firmly. "I think I fell in love with you even before St. Louis, although that kiss definitely helped. I love the way you're so darn caring and patient and calm. I love you've got gobs of money, but it doesn't matter to you, as long as you've got a road ahead of you. I love how you don't think anything of spending money where you think it's necessary and will do good, but you live here." She lifted her hands to gesture around the room. Hesitantly, he pointed out, "You love my money?" She chuckled. "I love you. I don't care about the money, but I wanted to tell you that, since I was so bitchy about it after meeting your Nana. Your grandfather left you money, my great-aunt left me money, but that doesn't define who we are." Stepping forward again, she reached for his hands. Even the one in the brace felt all warm and kinda tingly when she held it, and he was pretty sure it was all her and not the injury itself making his hand feel that way. Smiling, she met his eyes. "I love that you work so hard with these hands, Rhodey." "I love your hands, have I mentioned that?" But his mind was just all full of mush, it felt like. Okay, so here's the thing." She squeezed his hands. "I just showed up here and basically laid myself bare in front of you. I mean, kissing and saying, 'I love you,' and all that jazz. It's pretty traditional now for you to say something equally meaningful, or to shoot me down completely, which I would appreciate you doing sooner, rather than later, because my blood pressure can't take much more of this." "You want me to shoot you down?" "No." She rolled her eyes. "I want you to declare your undying love for me and tell me you want to go on adventures with me. Ditie Weston, will you marry me?" With those words, Rhodey's heart suddenly felt free. It was particularly impressive because her mouth dropped open, apparently at a loss for words. He smiled. "Wah," she managed. "Will you marry me?" His grin grew. "Because I gotta be honest, I don't think I can survive without you. I want to travel the country with you and help with your writing and charity. I want to be with you, and I want you in my arms every night and every day." Her eyes were wide. "Does that mean you love me?" His grin turned wicked as he used her grip on his hands to tug her forward. "Did I not mention that? I love you, Ditie. I love everything about you." And this time, when his mouth claimed hers, she melted against him. It was a long moment before he straightened, his fingertips itching to stroke her, but knowing from her bemused state she'd barely be able to stand on her own 2 feet. So he held her shoulders instead. "So? Will you marry me, Ditie? Are you serious? You really want to travel around in the breeze?" "Absolutely." His gaze darted to the stack of boxes near his closet. "I quit today." "Well, not really quit," he hurried to explain. "I knew I couldn't stay here if you turned me down. That's where I was heading, you know, when I saw the breeze out front. I was coming to see if there was any chance you love me the way I love you." "Your wrist," she murmured distractedly. "I can drive with one hand, although it's awkward," he told her, then shook his head. You're worth it, Ditie. I knew if you said no, if you didn't want to see me again, then I was going to have to move on. Maybe head back home, or maybe even St. Louis. I just knew I couldn't risk running into you here at the ranch, because my heart couldn't take it. But if I said yes? He took a deep breath and offered her a small smile. If you said yes, if you told me you did love me and wanted me in your life, then I wanted to be prepared. Ted Caudron okayed my plan to quit for the immediate future, but if and when we're not traveling, like when we're back home to visit, he'll hire me on an hourly basis for seasonal work. She shook her head, disbelief warring with hope in her expression. That's almost too good to be true. Smiling outright now, he pulled her against his chest. Sweetheart, I don't need the money, you know that. I've been working here for years and haven't really been spending on much of anything. It's all invested, and that's not even counting what Pop's left me, although I don't plan on dipping into that. I'll save it for our kids. She jerked in his arms, but he tightened his hold. Kids, came her muffled response against his shirt. Kids. I figure we can live on my savings and what Gertie left you, plus whatever sponsorships your blogging brings in, yeah? So the first kid, we could probably put on the couch after he's out of the crib, which I'll mount to the wall so it's not in the way, but then the second one, we might have to make use of pulling out the dinette for the extra bed. Kids? Chuckling now, he allowed her to pull away, and he framed her lovely face with his hands, brace and all. By the time we have 2 or 3 kids, we'll probably be ready to move back to Caudron Valley for a bit. Or upgrade to a bigger rig, I guess. You're serious? He could feel her pulse pounding under his fingertips. You want to do all that with me? Sweetheart, he brushed a kiss across her lips. I want to marry you. I want to live with you forever, and I'm hoping that means some time on the open road, but if you don't want that. No. I do. She blinked, then wrapped her arms around his waist. It'll be an adventure. Exactly. He grinned. I want to be your next, but lasts a lifetime, adventure. And I want you to be mine. Ditie Weston, will you marry me? Yes. Yes. And she was laughing when she pushed herself up to kiss him this time. Chapter 10. Ditie had been away for a year and hadn't gotten to experience the smoothly oiled wedding planning machine which Caudron Valley had become. Apparently, there'd been something like a dozen quick weddings which had taken place that summer, and since some of them had involved her own sisters, the Westons had gotten pretty good at planning quick weddings. Which was great, because Ditie didn't want to wait any longer than was necessary. Which was probably evident the moment Pastor Dinkelheimler announced Rhodey could kiss his bride, and she was the one to pull him down for the kiss. Not that he minded. She was determined to spend the rest of their lives making as many moves on him as necessary, until he was convinced how much she adored his touch. At the reception, Ditie kicked off her heels, which made her even shorter, but Rhodey didn't seem to care, and danced with her new husband until her feet hurt. And then they danced some more. Her brother-in-law Seth played his guitar, and there was plenty of country music on the stereo system, but for fun, Ditie arranged for the opening measures of the 1812 overture to come blaring out as they stepped into the reception, and Rhodey almost fell over laughing. Excuse me, may I cut in? Rhodey jerked away from her with a glare, but when he saw it was her twin brother asking for a dance, he rolled his eyes with a sigh. Fine. I'll go have another cupcake. His right wrist wasn't in a brace tonight, the doctor had told him he only needed to wear it now when he was doing something strenuous, and he used that hand to lift hers to his lips and brush a kiss across her fingers. It made her shiver and smile in anticipation. Then he placed her hand in Dawn's and winked. Her twin brother didn't hold her as close, obviously, but he was a pretty good dancer. Probably from all the years of football, which had made him strangely graceful. So are you ready to admit I was right? She stuck her tongue out at him, and he chuckled. Fine, you were right, Dawn. Rhodey just needed a little nudge. If my name were Rhododendron, I'd need a little nudge too. Narrowing her eyes, she ignored his smirk. I told you, the pastor insisted on using Rhodey's legal name. But if you don't forget it right this instant, I'm going to call you Adonis exclusively until we die. Since her brother liked his name about as much as she liked hers, she knew she had him there. He flushed, then shrugged, and said with a sigh, "Forget what?" "Exactly." Satisfied she'd gotten her way, she ducked her head. "Thanks for being the kick in the pants I needed. Thanks for coming home so I can kick you in the pants occasionally." He led her through a turn. "Of course, now you're heading off again." "Only for the honeymoon. I've always wanted to see the Grand Canyon." "We'll be back in a month or two." "It's going to take you that long to see one canyon?" he asked. "No, silly. We're going to see a lot of the Southwest. Then in a few years, we'll head back during the winter." "I can't wait." Truthfully, she couldn't wait for a lot of things. She couldn't wait for her life with Rhodey to really start. "I'm happy for you, sis." When Don grinned, she saw a smudge of red against his teeth. "Thanks. What have you been eating?" He shrugged, and as the song ended, stepped back. "The old lady who made those amazing raspberry mint cupcakes, she also made the cupcakes for Blake and Lainey's wedding, I think. Anyhow, she handed me this red cupcake and told me I had to eat it when I finished the white one I was eating at the time." Ditie hummed, then shrugged. "I only just met her, but Griselda seems a bit strange, doesn't she?" Grinning again, Don pulled her in for a hug. "She is at that, but a sweet little thing too." "Congratulations, sis. Rhodey's a good guy, and I'm really happy for you." As Ditie hugged him back, she wondered if her twin would ever get married. She'd never seen him interested in any woman. Except, maybe, one. "You're hugging my wife awfully close," came Rhodey's teasing voice. "Yeah," drawled Don, nudging her toward Rhodey's arms, "but we shared a womb, so I get first dibs on her." "Legally, I get first dibs," Rhodey pointed out. "Excuse me, I'm standing right here." Ditie planted her hands on her hips. "I get first dibs." Grinning, her husband lowered his head. "You can have first dibs on me anytime, sweetheart," he murmured, just before his lips claimed hers. Ditie woke up gradually, in the most delicious way possible. Sure, that wonderful mattress topper was under her, and sure, she was cozy under the covers, and of course, she still had 6 of her favorite pillows on the bed. But what made it really delicious, was her husband, whose hardness nestled against her rear end. Those few days they'd spent sleeping beside one another in the RV on their very first trip had been nowhere near as good as the real thing. Now that they were married, they didn't bother with sweatpants, or pajamas at all really. And he didn't have to worry about getting too close. No, he could hold her as close as they both wanted. Right now, his bare hand, there was no brace now, rested over her waist, the side of his thumb caressing the underside of her bare breast. He might still be asleep, but it felt so perfect, she had to stretch and press her backside against his hardness. The sensation made them both moan. "So you're finally awake," he murmured against her ear. Ditie wriggled her rear end. "And I can feel you're up." He growled in mock irritation, then tugged at her until she rolled over and draped herself atop him. They'd only been married for a few days, but they'd spent every night since then in their RV. And now that they were finally at the Grand Canyon, their honeymoon could really begin. But first things first. Panting with need, it was Ditie who finally called an end to their teasing foreplay and straddled his hips. When she impaled herself on his hardness, they both cried out in joy and moved together in the ancient, sensual dance. When they found their pleasure, they moaned together, and she collapsed against his chest, smiling. Later, much later, he was still humming happily as he stepped out of the shower, and she had to tease him. "Not a bad way to start the morning, huh?" He opened his mouth as if he were going to respond, but grabbed the front of her robe and pulled her in for a kiss instead. It was sweet and perfect and everything she'd ever wanted. "Your coffee's on the counter," she told him a moment later. "With 2% milk, just the way you like it." "Thanks, sweetheart." He didn't make a move to pull on clothes, but just wrapped a towel around his middle and reached into the closet. "Are you ready for your new adventure?" "Which one?" She was admiring his butt. "I think I'm enjoying marriage enough already, thanks." "The Grand Canyon," he corrected with a smirk as he straightened. Oh yeah, she murmured, her gaze pulled to the little gift bag in his lovely hands. The memory of what those hands could do, the pleasure they could bring her, had her shivering again, while warmth settled in her stomach. Again. Ditie, I forgot to give this to you on our wedding night. It's nothing special, but I saw it and thought of you. Her gaze snapped back up to his. Really? Because I got you something, but it's totally and completely dumb, so I didn't want it to be a wedding present or anything. Chuckling, he sank down on the bed, the towel parting to reveal one toned thigh. How about we call them start of honeymoon presents and exchange them now? My coffee can wait. Blushing slightly, she grabbed a little bag and threw herself onto the bed beside him, her robe opening slightly. Here, she blurted, thrusting the bag at him. He handed her the one he'd been holding and opened his bag. He was smiling when he pulled out a can of WD-40. Is this for the road trip snack drawer in the kitchen? You never did get around to fixing it, you know. He was chuckling when he nodded to the bag in her hands. Okay, your turn. She scrambled to open her present. Holding her breath, she pulled out a small box, though it was too big to be jewelry, and besides, she was wearing both rings he'd given her already, and yanked off the top. It's a wallet, he explained. To hold the essentials in your purse. Laughing, she launched herself at him and tackled him to the bed. Naturally, a kiss came next, and one of Rhodey's beautiful hands wrapped itself in her hair as his tongue darted across hers. Wait, he gasped suddenly, pulling away. There's something else. She caught his hand and pulled it to her mouth, placing a kiss in the middle of his palm. Then she glanced inside the gift bag and saw there was in fact one more thing. Without leaving her place on his chest, she pulled it from the bag. It was a simple little wooden plaque, the kind a tourist might find in a quaint little shop, carved with curlicues and a simple font. Home is where the heart is. When she glanced at him, he was looking uncertain. I thought it might be kinda cute to hang ITN in the kitchen. Or over the couch. Or whatever. Her fingers traced the words, then she laid the plaque down flat on the bed and placed those same fingers over his chest. I think that's a wonderful idea, although I don't need a reminder. His brows twitched upward. A reminder of what? Of where my heart is. This kiss was slow and sensual, and as the heat and need built up between them, Ditie knew the truth. Her home was wherever Rhodey was, and they were blessed to have the opportunity to travel the country and have adventures. Her audience was growing each day, and her husband seemed content to drive and explore, and occasionally, fix things. This might not be what the rest of their lives would be like, but she knew she'd drag that plaque with them wherever they went. Because as long as they were together, they were home. Sweetheart, he growled, rolling her over and pinning her on the mattress, his eyes dropping to where her robe had fallen open. If you keep this up, we won't get to the Grand Canyon anytime soon. And your coffee will get cold. One of his calloused fingertips stroked across her skin, and she arched into his touch. I'm willing to make sacrifices if you are, he murmured. She gasped. Have I ever told you how much I adore your hands? She asked, as she reached for his towel. With a lazy, sensual grin, he poised over her. I could stand to hear it again, sweetheart. She smiled up at her husband. I love your hands. I love you, Rhodey. And I love you, wife. Forever. They were both home. Where their hearts were. Epilogue. Adonis, Don Weston looked out from his deck at Caudron Valley. He'd found the perfect house, high on a hill, where he could watch the entire town when he had his 4 AM coffee. He took a sip of the brew in his hand, thinking about how many of his sisters had just gotten married. He wanted what they had. Marriage, family, love. There was only one catch. Every time he took a woman out, he thought about her. The woman who annoyed him more than any other on the face of the earth. Minerva. His sister's best friend, who had been the bane of his existence for as long as he could remember. He'd avoided her for years, and he would have thought that would make him stop thinking about her and that kiss they'd shared. But nothing made him stop thinking about her. Nothing at all. He shook his head and got to his feet. It was time to get dressed and get to the school for practice. He preferred early morning practices to after school. He felt like it made the boys give him their all and it taught them discipline. Even as the thought of discipline entered his mind, so did the thought of Minnie. Again. She was the most undisciplined human being alive. Why couldn't he stop thinking about her? He sighed. She wasn't his type. Not at all. He'd have to ask the new home economics teacher out. She was pretty enough. He was sure she was more his type. Miss Haggerty would be able to get Minnie out of his head. Of course she would. Then the world would be a better place. Or his head would anyway.